At my own mother's funeral, my father mocked her death and announced to the entire room that she died completely broke. She left me an old faded bank passbook. My father snatched it, laughed in my face, and threw it straight into a bucket of melting ice. He told me trash belongs with trash. I did not cry. I walked right out of that reception hall and went to the bank anyway. When the teller typed in the faded serial number, the color completely drained from her face. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes and whispered, "Do not leave this building." My name is Sarah. I am 29 years old, and I work as an administrative assistant at a small logistics company in Chicago. To understand how I ended up standing in a bank lobby with a soaking wet piece of paper that would destroy my father's entire life, you need to understand what happened 2 hours earlier at my mother's wake. The reception hall attached to the funeral home was suffocating. The air was thick with the smell of cheap Lily's stale coffee and the quiet murmurs of distant relatives who only showed up out of a sense of obligation. My mother Helen had passed away 3 days earlier after a quiet and lonely battle with illness. She was a gentlewoman, a woman who spent her entire life making herself incredibly small just so my father could feel big. I was standing in the corner of the room wearing a simple black dress, picking up empty water glasses and used napkins from the folding tables. I was trying to make myself invisible. It was a survival tactic I had perfected over the last 16 years. Then the heavy oak doors at the front of the hall swung wide open and all the quiet, respectful murmurs in the room died instantly. My father Robert walked in. He did not look like a grieving widower. He did not wear the heavy shoulders or the tired eyes of a man who had just buried his wife of 30 years. Instead, he strutted into the room wearing a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit. He walked arm in arm with his new fiancée, Jessica. Jessica was practically glowing. She was wearing a tight, sleeveless black cocktail dress that plunged at the neckline, looking like she was ready for a night out at an exclusive downtown club rather than a memorial service. Trailing right behind them was Chloe. Chloe was Jessica's 24-year-old daughter. She was wearing designer sunglasses indoors, tapping away on a brand new smartphone, and rolling her eyes at the modest surroundings. They looked like they had just stepped off a yacht. They brought an energy of absolute disrespect into the room, a loud, arrogant vibration that made my stomach turn. I gripped the plastic tray of empty glasses so hard my knuckles turned white. Robert did not walk over to the memorial display. He did not greet my mother's sisters. Instead, he gravitated immediately toward a group of his business associates who were standing near the makeshift bar at the back of the hall. These were men in expensive suits who nodded and laughed at everything my father said. I kept my head down and continued clearing the tables, slowly moving closer to where they stood. I could hear his booming voice carrying over the soft background music. Helen was a sweet woman, Robert laughed, swirling his glass of scotch. But let us be completely honest here. She was an absolute financial failure. The woman never earned a single penny in her entire life. She had no drive, no ambition. She was weak. Honestly, it is a miracle she survived as long as she did without me carrying her. One of his partners chuckled and patted Robert on the back. "It must have been a heavy burden on you, Robert. You have no idea," Robert boasted, taking a sip of his drink. "But I am finally free of that dead weight. In fact, I just secured the mortgage on a brand new 6-bedroom mansion in the wealthiest suburb in the state. Jessica and I are moving in next week. We are upgrading our lives, out with the old and in with the new." I felt a hard lump form in my throat. My mother was not even cold in the ground, and he was already bragging about replacing her. He was standing in the very room where we were supposed to be honoring her memory, and he was using it as a stage to flaunt his new wealth and his new younger fiancée. As I reached to clear a discarded coffee cup from the table right next to them, Robert caught sight of me. He stopped swirling his scotch. His eyes traveled up and down my cheap black dress. The confident, arrogant smile on his face twisted into a cruel sneer. "Well, look who decided to show up," Robert said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the people standing nearby. Jessica and Chloe turned to look at me. Chloe let out a quiet, mocking laugh and whispered something into Jessica's ear. I did not say anything. I just stared at him. "You know?" Robert continued turning back to his business partners but making sure his voice carried straight to me. This one here was always just like her mother. Stubborn, weak, and completely useless. I threw her out of my house when she was barely 13 years old. Can you believe that? 13. She thought she could stand up to me. She thought she could take Helen's side during an argument about money. I packed her miserable little belongings into 2 black garbage bags and tossed them on the front porch. I told her to go live in the streets if she loved her mother so much. He laughed, a deep rumbling sound that made my blood run cold. And look at her now. A 29-year-old secretary clearing dirty cups at a funeral. I guess the apple does not fall far from the tree. The business partners shifted uncomfortably, but none of them dared to defend me. Jessica leaned into Robert's shoulder and smiled sweetly at me. "You really should just leave, Sarah," she said in a sickeningly polite tone. "You are making everyone uncomfortable with your depressing energy. We are trying to celebrate a new chapter here." I wanted to scream. I wanted to drop the tray of dirty glasses right on the floor and tell the entire room what a monster he was. I wanted to tell them how he had emotionally abused my mother for decades, hiding his own financial insecurities behind a wall of rage and intimidation. But I knew better. Reacting was exactly what Robert wanted. He fed on tears. He thrived on making people feel small. So I swallowed the lump in my throat. I held my head high and I turned my back on them, walking toward the small office at the back of the community hall to drop off the tray. As I pushed through the swinging doors into the quiet hallway, I felt a gentle tap on my shoulder. I turned around to see Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis was a quiet older gentleman who had served as my mother's personal attorney for the last few years of her life. He was a kind man with kind eyes, and he always treated my mother with the respect my father never gave her. "Sarah," he said softly, glancing over his shoulder to make sure Robert had not followed us. "I am so terribly sorry for your loss. Your mother was a wonderful woman." "Thank you, Mr. Davis," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "It is just hard being in the same room as him." "I understand," he said. He reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a small sealed manila envelope. "I needed to find you before I left. Your mother entrusted this to me several months ago when her health started to rapidly decline. She gave me very strict instructions to hand this directly to you and only you on the day of her funeral." I looked at the envelope. It was surprisingly light. "What is it?" I asked, taking it from his hands. "It is the only thing she had left to her name," he said. "She wanted you to have it. She told me to tell you that she was sorry she could not protect you when you were young, but she hoped this would finally give you the protection you deserve." Mr. Davis offered a sad, tight smile and squeezed my shoulder once before turning around and walking back down the hallway, leaving me alone. My hands were shaking as I broke the seal on the envelope. I did not know what to expect. A letter, perhaps. A piece of jewelry she had managed to hide from Robert. Some small token of affection to remember her by. I tipped the envelope upside down, and a small rectangular object slid out into the palm of my hand. It was a bank passbook. It was dark blue with faded gold lettering on the front cover, indicating a local regional bank that had been operating in our city for over 50 years. The edges of the book were frayed and soft from age. The cardboard cover was creased right down the middle. I opened it carefully. The pages inside were yellowed. The printing inside was done by an old dot matrix machine, the kind they used decades ago before everything went completely digital. I stared at the lines of faded ink. I could not make sense of it. There were dates going back to when I was just a toddler. There was a name printed at the very top of the page. It was my mother's maiden name. Not her married name. The name she had before Robert ever came into her life and ruined it. I felt a strange fluttering in my chest. Why would my mother leave me an outdated bank passbook from a local branch? My father had always controlled every single bank account in our family. He monitored every dollar my mother spent. He gave her a strict allowance for groceries and screamed at her if she went over budget by even $5. He had convinced everyone, including me, that she was entirely dependent on him. That she brought absolutely no value to the marriage. I stared at the final line of ink on the yellowed page. The numbers were blurry. I rubbed my eyes trying to focus on the exact amount printed in the balance column. Just as I was about to read the number, the swinging doors burst open, hitting the wall with a loud bang. I jumped, dropping the manila envelope on the floor. Robert strode into the hallway, followed closely by Jessica and Chloe. His face was flushed with anger. "What are you doing hiding back here, Sarah?" he demanded. "Are you trying to steal from the catering budget? You always were a sneaky little rat." I quickly closed the passbook and clutched it against my chest. "I am not doing anything," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "Mr. Davis just gave me something from Mom." Robert's eyes narrowed. He looked at my hands. "What is that? What did that old fool give you?" "It is nothing," I lied, taking a step back. "Just a keepsake." Chloe pushed past her mother and marched right up to me. "Let me see it," she demanded, reaching out. I tried to pull away, but Chloe was fast. She snatched the blue passbook right out of my hands. She flipped it open and stared at the pages. A loud, cruel laugh erupted from her throat. "Oh my God," she cackled, waving the book in the air. "Look at this pathetic piece of garbage. It is an ancient bank book. The last time anyone stamped this thing was over 15 years ago." Robert stepped forward and grabbed the book out of Chloe's hand. He inspected the faded cover and snorted. A savings account. Helen had a secret savings account. He flipped the pages, his eyes scanning the blurry ink. He burst into a loud, booming laugh that echoed off the hallway walls. "There is barely $50 in here," he mocked, shaking his head. She hid a bank book for 20 years just to hoard 50 miserable dollars. God, she really was completely useless until her dying breath. "Give it back," I said, stepping forward. "It belongs to me." Robert looked at me with pure contempt. "It belongs to you. $50. What are you going to do with that, Sarah? Buy yourself a new dress so you do not look like a homeless person at a funeral." Jessica giggled, placing a manicured hand on Robert's arm. "Just throw it away, Robert. We are wasting our time dealing with her. We have a dinner reservation at the country club to celebrate our new house. We should not let this depressing girl ruin our perfect day." Robert smiled at Jessica. "You are absolutely right, my love." He turned his attention back to me, holding the passbook between his fingers like it was a diseased rat. "You listen to me, Sarah," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening whisper. "Your mother was a weak, pathetic loser. She lived her whole life in my shadow. She ate the food I bought. She slept under the roof I paid for. She died with nothing but this worthless piece of paper. And you are exactly like her. You will never amount to anything. You will spend the rest of your life scraping by on the bottom of the barrel just like she did." He turned around and walked toward the large silver ice bucket that the catering staff had set up near the door to hold the champagne bottles for his business guests. "Do you know what we do with trash?" Sarah Robert asked, looking over his shoulder at me. He did not wait for an answer. He tossed the blue passbook straight into the bucket of melting ice and freezing water. "Trash belongs with trash," he spat. Jessica and Chloe laughed out loud, linking their arms through Robert's and turning their backs on me to walk back out into the main reception hall. I stood alone in the hallway. I did not scream. I did not cry. The tears had completely dried up when I was 13 years old, shivering on a cold porch with black garbage bags. I slowly walked over to the silver ice bucket. I reached my bare hand into the freezing water, pushing aside the heavy ice cubes and the expensive champagne bottles. My fingers wrapped around the soggy dark blue cardboard. I pulled the passbook out. The water dripped onto the floor. I carefully wiped the wet pages against the black fabric of my dress, protecting the faded ink. I held my head up high. I pushed through the swinging doors and walked straight through the middle of the reception hall. Robert saw me leaving and raised his glass in a mocking toast. I did not look at him. I walked out the front doors into the bright afternoon sunlight. I got into my old 10-year-old sedan. The car smelled like wet paper. I put the keys in the ignition, but I did not drive home to cry. I looked at the name of the bank printed on the cover. I put the car in gear and drove straight to the local branch. I did not care that I was still wearing a damp funeral dress. I had to know why my mother had kept this hidden for my entire life. I had to know what was written on that final line. Chloe moved faster than I could anticipate. Her hand darted out and her long acrylic nails actually scratched the back of my wrist as she aggressively ripped the faded blue passbook right out of my fingers. I was so startled by the sudden physical intrusion that I took a step back, bumping into the edge of the memorial table. The framed photograph of my mother rattled against the wood. Chloe did not even offer a word of apology. She just stood there in her completely inappropriate designer cocktail dress, holding the only piece of my mother's legacy, like it was some kind of filthy, contaminated object. She flipped the worn cardboard cover open. Her eyes hidden behind those ridiculous oversized sunglasses scanned the yellowed pages inside. I watched her perfectly painted lips twitch before breaking into a wide, malicious grin. Then she started to laugh. It was not a quiet chuckle. It was a loud, hysterical cackling sound that pierced right through the somber atmosphere of the reception hall. She tossed her head back and laughed so hard that several guests from across the room actually stopped their conversations to turn and stare at us. "Oh my God!" Chloe shrieked, waving the passbook in the air for everyone to see. "You have got to be kidding me. Look at this pathetic piece of garbage. I thought the old bat might have actually left you something valuable. But this is an ancient bank book. The last time anyone even stamped a date in this thing was over 15 years ago." My face burned with a mixture of profound embarrassment and deep, rising anger. "Give it back to me," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "It does not belong to you, Chloe." But Chloe just held it higher out of my reach, acting like a high school bully playing keep away in the cafeteria. She tapped the page with her manicured finger, pointing to the final line of blurry dot matrix ink. "Look at the balance," she announced, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "There is barely $40 in here." $40. I spend more than that on my morning coffee orders in a single week. She left you $40. A few scattered snickers rose from the group of my father's business associates standing nearby. They were men in expensive suits who measured a person's entire worth by the size of their stock portfolio. To them, a $40 inheritance was not just a tragedy, it was a hilarious punchline. Before I could step forward to retrieve the book, my father Robert stepped into the circle. He smoothly plucked the blue passbook right out of Chloe's hand. He held it up to the light of the chandelier, inspecting the frayed edges and the watermarks on the cover with exaggerated theatrical disgust. He shook his head slowly, putting on a masterful performance of pity mixed with absolute contempt. "A secret savings account," Robert sneered, his lip curling upward. Helen actually kept a secret savings account hidden from me for all these years just to hoard $40 miserable dollars. He looked around the room, making sure he had the absolute attention of every single wealthy guest he had invited. He wanted them all to witness this. He wanted to cement his narrative that he was the successful magnate, and my mother was nothing but a burden he had graciously carried. "This right here," Robert proclaimed, tapping the passbook against his palm, "is the perfect representation of my late wife. She lived small. She thought small. She had absolutely no vision and no ambition. For 30 years, I provided everything for her. I put the food on her table. I put the clothes on her back. I paid every single medical bill when her body finally started giving out on her. And what did she do? She squirreled away loose change like a frightened mouse hiding in the walls. $40. It is truly pathetic." He turned his cold eyes back to me. "You see, Sarah, this is why I had to kick you out of my house when you were 13. You were completely infected by her weak mindset. You took her side when I tried to teach you about the real world. You thought she was a victim. But she was not a victim. She was just a loser. And she died exactly as she lived. Completely and utterly broke." The cruelty in his words felt like physical blows. He was standing 20 feet away from the urn, holding my mother's ashes, and he was dismantling her dignity piece by piece. He was destroying her memory just to make himself look taller. I could see my aunts, my mother's sisters, standing near the back wall. They were crying quietly, but they were too terrified of Robert's temper to step forward and intervene. Everyone was terrified of him. He controlled the money, so he controlled the room. Jessica, my father's. New fiancée stepped up beside him and slipped her arm through his. She looked at the passbook and wrinkled her nose in disgust. "Robert, darling," she purred, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Why are we even giving this any energy? We are moving into the new mansion on Tuesday. We have that massive engagement gala to plan. We are entering a brand new, beautiful chapter of our lives together. We really should not let this depressing, miserable girl ruin the aesthetic of our afternoon. Just get rid of that dirty old thing so we can go back to celebrating." Robert smiled down at Jessica. "You are absolutely right, my love," he said, his voice dripping with affection that he had never once shown my mother. "We are upgrading our lives. Out with the old and in with the new." He turned his attention back to the passbook. He held it between his thumb and index finger, holding it as far away from his expensive suit jacket as possible. He looked around the room until his eyes landed on the catering table set up near the exit. In the center of the table sat a massive ornate silver ice bucket. It was filled to the brim with melting ice cubes and freezing water, currently chilling 4 bottles of vintage champagne that Robert had ordered specifically to toast his new real estate acquisitions. He locked eyes with me. His gaze was entirely devoid of any parental warmth. It was the look of a predator stepping on a wounded bird. "Do you know what we do with garbage in the real world, Sarah?" he asked, his voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room. "We throw it away." He did not wait for me to answer. He walked deliberately toward the catering table. Every eye in the reception hall followed him. I stood completely frozen, rooted to the spot, watching the nightmare unfold in slow motion. Robert held my mother's final earthly possession directly over the silver ice bucket. He opened his fingers. The dark blue cardboard dropped. It hit the surface of the freezing water with a soft splash, instantly sinking between the green glass of the champagne bottles. "Trash belongs with trash," Robert announced loudly. He turned around, brushed his hands together as if he had just disposed of something toxic, and walked back toward his business partners. Jessica and Chloe burst into genuine, delighted laughter. They linked their arms together and turned their backs on me, completely dismissing my existence. The room remained dead silent for a long, uncomfortable moment. The guests shifted their weight, staring at the floor, staring at the walls, staring anywhere but at me. They were waiting for my reaction. They were expecting the performance of a broken daughter. They wanted me to burst into tears. They wanted me to fall to my knees and beg. They wanted me to run out the back doors, sobbing hysterically, just like I did when I was a terrified 13-year-old girl being thrown out onto the street. But I was not 13 years old anymore. I did not shed a single tear. My vision did not blur. My breathing did not hitch. Instead, a profound, terrifying calmness washed over my entire body. It was as if all the anxiety, all the fear, and all the intimidation I had carried around my father for my entire life suddenly evaporated into thin air. The heat in my face completely disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. I took a step forward. My cheap black shoes clicked firmly against the hardwood floor. I walked directly past the group of wealthy businessmen. I walked past Chloe, who stopped laughing and watched me with a confused expression. I walked past Jessica, who instinctively took a half-step backward. I walked right up to the silver ice bucket sitting on the catering table. I looked down into this freezing water. The blue passbook was resting at the bottom, wedged between a block of ice and the heavy base of a champagne bottle. The cardboard cover was already beginning to warp and soften from the moisture. I did not hesitate. I plunged my bare hand straight into the bucket. The water was shockingly cold, biting into my skin like hundreds of tiny needles. I pushed the heavy glass bottles aside, ignoring the loud clinking sounds that echoed through the quiet room. My fingers found the soggy cardboard. I gripped it tightly and pulled it out of the water. It was dripping heavily, leaving a trail of freezing water across the white linen tablecloth. I held the soaked passbook in both hands. I did not ask for a napkin. I did not look around for a towel. I simply pressed the dripping wet book directly against the stomach of my black morning dress. I pressed my hands down hard, squeezing the excess water out of the pages and letting it soak right through the cheap fabric into my skin. The freezing water ran down the front of my dress, clinging to my legs, but I did not flinch. I just stood there methodically and calmly drying my mother's legacy against my own body. Jessica let out a loud, dramatic gasp of pure revulsion. "Oh my God!" she shrieked, taking another step away from me, holding her designer handbag against her chest, as if my poverty was somehow contagious. "You are absolutely repulsive. Look at you. You are dripping wet in the middle of a reception hall. You are making a complete fool of yourself. Get out of my sight right now. You are ruining everything." I finished pressing the moisture from the book. The cardboard was damp and slightly warped, but the pages inside were intact. I held it firmly in my right hand. I slowly turned to face Jessica. I looked at her perfectly styled hair, her expensive jewelry paid for by my father's cruel financial manipulation, and her face twisted in disgust. Then I shifted my gaze to Robert. He was watching me with a tight, furious expression, furious that I had not broken down, furious that I had defied his little theatrical display. I did not shout. I did not hurl insults. I did not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply looked at my father with absolute dead-eyed indifference. I looked at him the way you look at a stranger on the street who means absolutely nothing to you. Then I turned my back on them all. I walked toward the main exit of the hall. The crowd of relatives and business partners literally parted down the middle to let me through. Nobody said a word to me. Nobody tried to stop me. The only sound in the room was the steady rhythmic clicking of my shoes against the floor and the faint dripping of ice water falling from my soaked dress. I reached the heavy front doors, pushed them open with my free hand, and walked out into the bright, glaring afternoon sunlight without looking back even once. The heat of the parking lot hit me instantly, but I was shivering from the ice water soaked into my clothes. I walked straight to my old 10-year-old sedan, parked at the very back of the lot, far away from the gleaming luxury SUVs belonging to Robert's friends. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut, sealing myself inside the quiet cabin. The smell of stale champagne and freezing water immediately filled the cramped space of my car. My dress was sticking uncomfortably to my thighs, and the cold was seeping deep into my bones. But my hands were completely steady. I placed the damp blue passbook carefully on the passenger seat right next to my purse. I looked at the faded gold lettering stamped across the cover. It was the name of a local regional bank, a branch located just a few miles away from the funeral home. I put the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered for a second before roaring to life, the familiar sound grounding me in reality. I gripped the steering wheel tight, wrapping my fingers around the worn leather. My father thought he had won today. He thought he had proven his dominance by humiliating me and destroying my mother's memory in front of an audience. He truly believed that this blue book was nothing but a piece of garbage holding $40 worthless dollars. He believed he was completely invincible. But as I shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the parking lot heading straight toward the downtown financial district, I felt a strange spark of anticipation ignite in my chest. My mother was a deeply intelligent woman. She endured decades of Robert's financial abuse and psychological torment with a quiet, calculating patience. She would never have tasked a lawyer to hand-deliver a useless piece of trash to me on the day of her funeral. There was a reason she kept this hidden for over 20 years. There was a reason she specifically waited until she was gone to pass it into my hands. I drove past the city limits, the smell of alcohol and wet fabric filling my lungs. I did not care that I looked like a wreck. I did not care that my black dress was stained and clinging to my skin. I did not care that my hair was damp from the condensation. I was going to walk straight into that bank lobby exactly as I was. I kept my eyes on this road, the facade of the bank building coming into view in the distance. The next conflict was already brewing, just waiting for me to walk through those glass doors. I was about to find out exactly what my mother had left behind, and I was going to use every single ounce of it to tear my father's fake empire down to the foundation. The drive to the bank was a blur of gray streets and flashing traffic lights. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. The freezing water from the ice bucket had soaked completely through the front of my black morning dress, chilling my skin, but my mind was burning with a quiet, intense focus. I pulled into the parking lot of the First Regional Bank branch. It was a stately brick building sitting squarely in the middle of the downtown financial district. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet cabin of my car for a long moment. I looked down at the passenger seat. The dark blue passbook rested there. The edges of the cardboard cover were warped and stained from the champagne ice water, but the faded gold lettering was still visible. I took a deep breath, picked up the passbook, and stepped out of the car. The afternoon sun beat down on the pavement, but I could not feel the warmth. I walked through the heavy double-glass doors of the bank. The blast of air conditioning hit my wet clothes, sending a violent shiver down my spine. The lobby was pristine. It smelled of polished marble, expensive floor wax, and fresh coffee. It was a sharp, aggressive contrast to the suffocating smell of stale lilies and cheap alcohol I had just left behind at the funeral reception. I walked straight across the polished floor toward the main counter. A few customers waiting in line turned to look at me. I knew exactly what they saw. They saw a 29-year-old woman with damp hair, wearing a ruined dress, clutching a piece of wet cardboard to her chest. I did not care about their stares. I did not care about the quiet whispers I heard as I passed them. I marched directly up to the first available teller window. The teller was a young woman with a perfectly pressed uniform and a polite, rehearsed smile. Her name tag read, Emily. She looked up at me, and her polite smile faltered for a fraction of a second as she took in my appearance. "How can I help you today, Mom?" she asked, her voice carrying that careful, neutral tone reserved for unpredictable situations. I placed the damp passbook on the cold marble counter and slid it toward her. It left a small trail of water droplets on the glass surface. "I need to check the status of this account, please," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "My mother just passed away. This is the only thing she left behind." Emily looked down at the dark blue booklet. Her eyes widened slightly in surprise. "Oh," she murmured, "I am so terribly sorry for your loss. Please give me just one moment." She picked up the passbook by the very edges, handling it as if it might fall apart in her hands. She carefully opened the wet cover and stared at the yellowed pages inside. I watched her brow furrow in confusion. She looked at the date of the last printed transaction. It had been stamped over 15 years ago. I could see the pity forming in her eyes. She probably thought the same thing my father thought. She probably thought she was looking at the forgotten savings account of a poor elderly woman containing no more than a few dollars. "Let me look this up for you," Emily said softly. "We do not see these old passbooks very often anymore. Everything is digitized now. I just need to type in the serial number to find the active ledger." She turned to her computer terminal and began typing. The clicking of her keyboard sounded abnormally loud in the quiet lobby. I stood perfectly still, watching the reflection of her computer screen in the glass partition behind her. I felt my chest tighten. A sudden wave of doubt washed over me. What if my father was right? What if I had just caused a massive scene, walked out of my mother's funeral, and driven all the way across town for an account holding $40? Emily hit the enter key. Instantly, a loud beep chimed from her computer terminal. The reflection in the glass behind her turned bright, glaring red. Emily's hands froze over her keyboard. The polite, sympathetic customer service mask dropped completely from her face. All the color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking pale and terrified. She leaned closer to the monitor as if she could not believe what her own eyes were seeing. She typed another sequence of numbers very slowly. She hit enter again. The bright red warning screen remained. She slowly turned her head and looked at me. Her eyes were wide and her breathing had suddenly become shallow. "Ma'am," she whispered. Her voice was shaking so badly I could barely hear her over the background hum of the bank lobby. "Ma'am, please do not leave. I must call the branch manager immediately." Before I could even open my mouth to ask her what was wrong, she grabbed the phone on her desk and pressed a quick dial button. She turned her back to me, pulling the receiver close to her face, shielding her mouth with her hand. I could not hear what she was saying, but I saw her shoulders trembling. Panic started to claw at the edges of my mind. What did that red screen mean? Did my mother leave behind a massive debt? Had my father somehow tracked me here and locked the account? Was the police on their way? My mind raced through every terrible possibility. I stood frozen at the counter, gripping the edge of the marble so hard my fingers ached. Less than 60 seconds later, a heavy oak door at the far end of the lobby swung open. A tall, distinguished man in a dark tailored suit walked out. He did not walk with the casual, confident stroll of a bank manager greeting a regular client. He walked with intense, urgent purpose. His eyes swept across the lobby, zeroing in on Emily's window, and then locking directly onto me. He moved quickly across the floor, bypassing the line of waiting customers. When he reached the counter, he did not even look at Emily. He looked straight at me and then down at the wet blue passbook resting on the marble. "Ms. Sarah Myers," he asked, his voice low and authoritative. "Yes," I answered, my heart pounding against my ribs. "I am Bradley, the branch manager," he said. "Please come with me right now." He unlatched the small security gate next to the teller stations and gestured for me to step through. I followed him, leaving the public lobby behind. We walked down a long, quiet corridor lined with frosted glass windows. The air back here was colder, the silence heavier. He led me to the very last office at the end of the hall. The brass plate on the door read, "Executive Management." He ushered me inside. It was a large, plush office with a massive mahogany desk and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the busy downtown streets. The moment I crossed the threshold, Bradley shut the heavy wooden door behind us. The lock engaged with a loud, definitive click. Then he walked straight to the windows, grabbed the control cord, and aggressively pulled the heavy blinds shut, plunging the room into shadow. He turned on a small desk lamp, casting a warm amber glow across the room. "Please sit down," he instructed, pointing to a high-backed leather chair across from his desk. I sat down. The wet fabric of my dress ruined the expensive leather, but neither of us cared. Bradley walked around his desk, carrying the damp blue passbook. He placed it directly in the center of his blotter like it was a sacred artifact. He sat down, folded his hands, and looked at me with an expression of intense, absolute seriousness. "Ms. Myers," he began, his tone completely stripped of all standard corporate pleasantries. "Before we proceed, I need to confirm your identity. Do you have a government-issued identification on you?" I reached into my purse with shaking hands, pulled out my driver's license, and slid it across the desk. He took it, inspected it carefully against the information pulled up on his dual computer monitors, and then slid it back to me. "Thank you," he said. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Tell me what you think this blue book is." I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. "My sister said it was an old savings account. My father said it was trash. He said my mother died completely broke." Bradley closed his eyes for a brief moment and let out a long, slow breath. He shook his head. He looked back at me, and his eyes were filled with a profound mixture of awe and heavy solemnity. "Your father is a deeply ignorant man," Bradley said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "This is not an ordinary savings passbook, Ms. Myers. It has not been a regular savings account for decades. What you are looking at is a highly specialized bearer instrument. It is the physical binding key to a payable on death taught trust." I stared at him, trying to process the legal terminology. "A trust?" I asked. Bradley nodded. "A taught trust is a specific legal structure where the creator deposits funds during their lifetime, but designates a sole beneficiary to inherit the entire sum immediately upon their passing, without the need for probate court. But your mother went a step further. She added a rigid physical security clause. She mandated that the funds could never be touched, never be transferred, and never be acknowledged to any outside party unless this exact physical passbook was presented in person alongside the verified signature of the sole beneficiary." He tapped the damp, warped cover of the book. "She essentially turned this piece of cardboard into a vault key," he explained. "Without it, the account practically does not exist to the outside world. It cannot be garnished by creditors. It cannot be claimed by a spouse. It is an ironclad fortress of asset protection." My mind was spinning. I thought about the way my father had controlled my mother. I thought about the weekly screaming matches over the grocery bill. I thought about my mother wearing shoes with holes in the soles because my father refused to give her $20 to buy a new pair. "How much is in it?" I whispered, my voice cracking. Bradley turned one of his computer monitors around so it faced me directly. "Look for yourself," he said quietly. I leaned forward, staring at the glowing screen. The account ledger was displayed in stark black and white. My eyes skipped past the account routing numbers and landed directly on the total available balance line. I stopped breathing. The numbers blurred together, and I had to blink hard to clear my vision. I read it again, and then a third time. $6,842,000. I fell back against the leather chair, feeling as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the room. My hands flew to my mouth. I shook my head, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. 6.8 million, I choked out. That is impossible. My mother worked at a grocery store before she got sick. She never had anything. My father took every paycheck she ever earned. Where did this come from? Bradley reached into a locked drawer in his desk and pulled out a thick, sealed file folder. He opened it and laid a stack of heavily redacted historical documents on the desk. "Your mother was a brilliant woman, Ms. Myers," he said, his voice filled with deep respect. "Decades ago, long before you were even born, your mother inherited a parcel of land in the Midwest from her late grandfather. It was largely considered worthless scrubland. She never told your father about it. But in the late 1990s, a major geological survey discovered a massive deposit of rare earth minerals beneath that land." He pointed to a faded contract from the year 2001. "Your mother quietly negotiated the sale of those mineral rights to an energy conglomerate," Bradley continued. "She did it entirely through a blind proxy. She funneled the proceeds of that sale directly into this trust. She set the parameters so tightly that no one, not even her own husband, could ever discover it during her lifetime." Tears began to spill over my eyelashes, running down my cheeks, hotly contrasting with the freezing dampness of my clothes. My mother was not weak. She was not a failure. She had sat in silence for decades, enduring the mocking, the abuse, the constant degradation from my father, all while sitting on an absolute fortune. Why I wept, wiping my face with the back of my hand. Why did she live in poverty when she had all this? Why did she endure him for so long? "Because of you," Bradley answered softly. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes filled with profound understanding. "If she had divorced him and brought this money to light, your father would have tied her up in litigation for the rest of her natural life. He would have used his aggression and his attorneys to claim half of it as marital property. But more importantly, he would have used you as leverage. He would have fought for custody just to control the purse strings." Bradley pointed to the damp blue passbook sitting on the desk. "She lived in poverty to protect you," he said. "She knew the kind of man your father was. She knew that if he got his hands on this money, he would burn through it in a matter of years, leaving you with absolutely nothing. So she played the long game. She played the part of the broken, penniless wife. She endured his cruelty because she knew that the only way to ensure your ultimate survival and your complete financial independence was to wait until the very end. She made sure that the moment she drew her last breath, you would hold the ultimate weapon against him." The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. My mother had sacrificed her own comfort, her own pride, and her own dignity every single day of her life just to build a secret fortress for me. She let my father mock her. She let him belittle her. She let the whole world believe she was nothing just so I could eventually have everything. And my father, in his absolute supreme arrogance, had literally thrown that $6.8 million fortress right into a bucket of ice water because he was too busy trying to humiliate me to recognize his own salvation. A fierce, burning heat ignited deep in my chest. It burned away the last remnants of the frightened 13-year-old girl who used to cry on the front porch. It burned away the grief of the morning. All that was left was cold, sharp, diamond-hard resolve. Bradley watched my expression change. He closed the thick file folder and rested his hands on top of it. I need you to listen to me very carefully right now, Sarah, Bradley said, his voice tightening with urgency. The money is legally yours, but we have a very serious immediate problem, and it involves your father. Bradley leaned forward and folded his hands together on the heavy mahogany desk. The amber light from the small desk lamp cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the deep lines of concern and barely contained anger etched into his features. He looked at me, not just as a bank manager speaking to a client, but as a man who had witnessed something deeply profoundly wrong and was finally able to bring it to the light. For the past 3 months, Bradley began, his voice steady, but carrying a heavy weight. Your father has been waging an absolute war against this institution. While your mother was lying in that hospice bed, fighting for every breath she took, your father was incredibly busy behind her back. He was not making end-of-life arrangements. He was not sitting by her side holding her hand. He was actively trying to execute a hostile takeover of her entire financial existence. I sat frozen in the leather chair. The freezing water from the Passbook had soaked entirely through my black morning dress, but the chill I felt radiating through my body had nothing to do with the wet fabric. It was the icy realization of my father's absolute depravity. Bradley reached into the thick file folder he had placed on the desk. He pulled out a stack of papers clipped together and turned them around so I could read them. The top page was a medical document. It had the official letterhead of a local clinic and a doctor's signature at the bottom. "Look closely at this," Bradley instructed, tapping the paper with his index finger. I leaned forward. The document was a formal medical declaration stating that Helen was suffering from severe advanced dementia and was entirely incapable of managing her own affairs. It requested that her husband Robert be granted immediate and total power of attorney over all her assets, including any and all trusts held in her name. My stomach churned with a sickening mixture of disgust and fury. "My mother never had dementia," I said, my voice trembling with rising anger. Her mind was perfectly clear until the very last day. Her body failed her, but her mind was sharp. "This is a complete lie." "I know it is a lie," Bradley said, nodding gravely. "Our legal department knew it was a lie too. We employ independent investigators for accounts of this magnitude. When your father submitted this document 90 days ago demanding that we transfer the total balance of the Totten Trust into a joint account under his control, we immediately flagged it for fraud. We sent our own representative to the hospice care facility to speak with the nursing staff. They confirmed that your mother was entirely lucid. Your father forged this medical declaration. He likely paid off an unethical physician or simply fabricated the letterhead entirely." He pulled out another document from the stack. This one was a legal petition filed in the county court, attempting to declare my mother legally incompetent. "When the medical route failed, your father escalated his tactics," Bradley continued. "He filed emergency injunctions. He threatened to sue our legal department. He called this branch every single day, screaming at my tellers, demanding to speak with the board of directors. He claimed we were unlawfully withholding his marital assets. He was desperate, Sarah. He was acting like a man whose very life depended on getting his hands on that $6.8 million before your mother passed away." I stared at the forged signatures and the aggressive legal threats printed on the pages before me. "Why?" I asked, shaking my head in disbelief. "Why the sudden panic? He controlled every penny she had. He controlled the household finances for 30 years. Why did he suddenly need to seize a trust he could have just waited to inherit?" "Because he was never going to inherit it," Bradley answered, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute certainty. And deep down, I think he realized that. "But more importantly, he needed the cash immediately because your father has built a massive house of cards and it is entirely founded on stolen money." Bradley pulled a third set of documents from the folder. These were not bank records. These were property deeds, loan agreements, and vehicle registration forms. "Your father likes to present himself as a highly successful man," Bradley said, a note of deep professional disgust entering his voice. "But the truth is, he is drowning in debt. Over the last 6 months, he has taken out multiple high-interest bridge loans from private predatory lenders. These are not standard mortgages, Sarah. These are aggressive short-term loans designed for quick payouts. but they come with astronomical interest rates and immediate balloon payments. He pointed to a photograph of the sprawling 6-bedroom mansion Robert had been bragging about at the funeral reception. He used those private loans to purchase this estate, Bradley explained. He also used them to purchase the luxury sports car you likely saw parked outside the funeral home. He bought expensive jewelry for his new fiancée. He has been living the lifestyle of a multimillionaire. But he does not have the actual capital to sustain it. He used a tiny piece of intercepted mail and old tax document he must have found hidden in your mother's belongings to prove to these private lenders that his wife possessed a trust fund worth nearly $7 million. I felt the breath catch in my throat as the sheer audacity of my father's plan became clear. He leveraged her money before she was even dead, I whispered. Exactly, Bradley confirmed. He convinced these private lenders that the moment his sick wife passed away, the trust would automatically transfer to him as the surviving spouse. He told them he would pay off the massive balloon loans in full the second the death certificate was signed. He was so incredibly arrogant that he assumed the money was already his. He spent it before he even had access to it. I looked at the documents outlining the massive crushing debt my father had signed his name to. Millions of dollars in short-term loans all coming due immediately. But he hit a brick wall, Bradley said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. Taught trusts do not pass through probate court. They do not default to a surviving spouse. They bypass the entire legal marital estate completely. They belong solely and exclusively to the designated beneficiary listed on the original formation document. And that is me. I said, the reality of the situation finally taking root in my mind. That is you, Bradley agreed. When your father finally realized that he could not bully our legal department into giving him the money he demanded to know the requirements for disbursement, our attorneys told him exactly what the bylaws of the trust demanded. They told him that the only way those funds would ever be released was if the designated beneficiary walked into this branch in person and presented the original physical passbook. The room grew completely silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning vent above us. I slowly looked down at the mahogany desk. Resting right in the center of the green leather blotter was the dark blue cardboard passbook. The edges were still damp from the champagne ice water. I stared at it. I thought about the scene at the funeral reception just 2 hours ago. I thought about Robert snatching this exact book out of Chloe's hands. I thought about him mocking the faded ink and the old dot matrix printing. I thought about him sneering at the $50 balance written on the very last line of the first page. He did not know I said my voice barely above a whisper. He had no idea what this actually was. Bradley offered a grim, satisfied smile. Your father is a man who measures wealth by shiny digital bank apps and plastic credit cards. When our lawyers told him he needed the physical passbook, he was likely looking for a modern digital security token or a keycard to a safety deposit box. When your mother's attorney handed you a frayed, outdated blue booklet from 30 years ago, your father looked right at it and saw absolutely nothing. He thought it was just a forgotten savings account, I said, my mind replaying every single second of the confrontation. He thought she had hidden $40 from him. He threw it away to prove a point. He threw it away to humiliate me. And in doing so, Bradley said, leaning forward, his eyes shining with cold, hard justice, he literally threw away his only lifeline. The poetic justice of the situation was so massive, so overwhelmingly perfect, that I actually felt dizzy. My father had spent his entire life making my mother feel small. He had spent his entire life tearing me down, telling me I was worthless, throwing me out onto the street like discarded garbage. He built an empire of lies and debt, believing he was the smartest man in any room he walked into. He had stood in the middle of that reception hall surrounded by his wealthy friends, and he had held the exact key to his own salvation in his bare hands. All he had to do was hold on to it. All he had to do was swallow his pride for 5 minutes. If he had just taken the book and read the fine print on the inside cover, he would have realized what it was. If he had just treated me with 1 single ounce of basic human decency, he might have been able to manipulate me into signing the money over to him later. But his cruelty was stronger than his sense of self-preservation. His absolute desperate need to belittle women, to mock poverty, to establish his dominance over me and my mother blinded him completely. He looked at a document worth almost $7 million, and he threw it into a bucket of melting ice simply because he wanted to see me cry. He threw away $6.8 million to get a laugh out of his new fiancée. A sudden sharp laugh escaped my lips. It started small, a quiet breath of disbelief, but it quickly grew into a real, genuine laugh. It was a laugh born from 15 years of carrying a heavy, suffocating weight that had suddenly miraculously evaporated. I covered my mouth with my hand, but I could not stop the laughter from bubbling up in my chest. Bradley watched me for a moment, and then his grim smile widened into a true expression of shared vindication. He understood. He had seen what my father was capable of, and he knew exactly how satisfying this moment was for me. He is going to lose everything, I said, my laughter subsiding into a quiet, fierce joy. The house, the cars, the fake lifestyle. When those private lenders realize he does not have the money, they are going to take everything he owns. They will take more than that. Bradley corrected, his tone becoming deadly serious once again. Remember Sarah, he forged medical documents. He committed identity theft and bank fraud in an attempt to secure those loans. The private lenders he used are not going to simply repossess a house and walk away. They will file federal fraud charges. The moment the balloon payment defaults and they discover the collateral was faked, your father will be facing multiple felony counts. He will be looking at serious federal prison time. I looked back down at the damp passbook. My mother's silence, her poverty, her quiet suffering, it all made perfect sense now. She had engineered a masterpiece. She had built a trap so perfectly customized to my father's specific brand of narcissistic arrogance that he had walked right into it without ever seeing the walls closing in around him. She knew he would underestimate her. She knew he would mock anything old or modest. She weaponized his own vanity against him. So what do we do now? I asked, looking up at Bradley. My voice was no longer shaking. My hands were completely steady. I felt a surge of power coursing through my veins, a power I had never been allowed to feel in my entire life. Bradley opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of pristine legal forms bearing the official seal of the bank. He placed a heavy silver pen on top of the papers and slid them across the desk toward me. First, we secure the perimeter, Bradley said professionally. You are going to sign these forms officially executing the Totten Trust and transferring the entire balance of $6,842,000 into a newly established private high-security account in your name only. We will lock it down behind a biometric firewall that your father could not breach, even if he hired an army of lawyers. I picked up the silver pen. The metal felt heavy and cold in my hand. And then what I asked, poising the pen over the signature line. Then Bradley said, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers, we let him dig his own grave. Right now, your father thinks he just threw away $40. Within the next few days, his lenders are going to demand payment. He is going to panic. He is going to call our legal department again, demanding access to the trust. And when he does, our lawyers are going to politely inform him that the physical passbook he needs to access the funds has already been successfully presented to the bank by the designated beneficiary. A cold shiver of pure, unadulterated satisfaction ran down my spine. He is going to realize that the trash he threw in the ice bucket was the trust fund he has been trying to steal for 3 months. He will realize that he literally threw away his only escape route, Bradley confirmed. And more importantly, he will realize that you picked it up. He will know that you hold all the power. He will know that his entire survival depends entirely on the daughter he threw out on the street 15 years ago. I looked at the signature line on the banking form. I thought about the 13-year-old girl crying on the front porch, sitting next to black garbage bags, waiting for a father who never came outside to apologize. I thought about my mother wearing old threadbare sweaters while my father drove a new truck. I thought about the cruel laughter echoing in the funeral hall just hours ago. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name. The ink flowed smoothly, dark and permanent. I signed every page Bradley placed in front of me, officially claiming my mother's final gift to me. I officially claimed my freedom. When I signed the last page, Bradley gathered the documents and placed them securely inside a thick leather folio. He took the damp blue passbook, the artifact that had started this entire chain of events, and locked it inside a small metal safe behind his desk. "It is done," Bradley said, looking at me with deep respect. "The funds are entirely in your control, Sarah. Your father cannot touch you. He cannot hurt you. He has absolutely no power here." I stood up from the leather chair. My black dress was still damp, clinging uncomfortably to my skin, but I did not care. I felt taller than I had ever felt in my life. I felt invincible. "Thank you, Mr. Bradley," I said, extending my hand. "Thank you for protecting my mother's legacy." "It is my privilege, Ms. Myers," he replied, shaking my hand firmly. "Now, I suggest you go home, lock your doors, and hire a very good attorney. Because when your father realizes what he has done, he is not going to go quietly. He is going to be desperate, and desperate men can be very unpredictable." "I know exactly what he is," I said, my voice hard and resolute, "and I am ready for him." I turned and walked out of the manager's office, the heavy oak door closing behind me. I walked back down the quiet corridor through the security gate and out into the main lobby. The teller, Emily, caught my eye as I passed. Her face was still pale, but she offered me a small tentative nod of solidarity. I nodded back. I pushed through the double glass doors and stepped back out into the bright, glaring afternoon sun. The heat of the pavement immediately surrounded me, beginning to dry the damp fabric of my dress. I walked across the parking lot toward my old sedan. Every step felt lighter. Every breath felt cleaner. I pulled my car keys out of my purse. As my thumb brushed against the plastic fob, my cell phone, buried deep inside my bag, began to ring loudly. I stopped walking. I slowly unzipped my purse and pulled the phone out. The screen was lit up, displaying a name I had not saved in my contacts, but knew entirely by heart. It was Robert. The calls were coming in back-to-back, relentless and demanding. I stared at the glowing screen, watching his name flash over and over again. The panic had already started. The timeline had shifted. My father had just received a phone call from his mortgage broker. The bank was refusing to clear the funds for his new mansion. The house of cards was already beginning to sway in the wind. He finally realized what that passbook was. I let the phone ring until it went to voicemail. Then it immediately started ringing again. He was frantic. He was terrified. He was finally feeling a fraction of the fear he had inflicted on my mother for 30 years. I did not answer the phone. I smiled a cold, sharp smile that reached all the way to my eyes. I slid the ringing phone back into my purse, unlocked my car, and drove away, leaving him to panic in the ruins of his own making. The drive from the bank back to my modest apartment complex felt like a strange out-of-body experience. My hands gripped the steering wheel, but I barely registered the traffic around me. My mind was entirely consumed by the staggering revelation I had just uncovered in Manager Bradley's office. $6,842,000. My mother, the woman who had worn mended sweaters and endured my father's constant financial abuse, had spent decades quietly building an impenetrable fortress for my future. She had endured a life of manufactured poverty just to ensure my ultimate survival. As I pulled my 10-year-old sedan into the assigned parking spot of my building, the heavy reality of the situation finally settled over me. I turned off the ignition and let the silence of the car wash over me. The damp fabric of my black morning dress still clung to my skin, a physical reminder of the freezing ice bucket where my father had casually tossed my mother's legacy. He thought it was trash. He thought he had completely destroyed the last remnant of her dignity. I reached into my purse to grab my keys, and my hand brushed against my cell phone. The screen was completely lit up. I pulled the phone out and stared at the display. 47 missed calls. 12 new voicemails. Every single one of them was from Robert. A cold smile touched the corners of my mouth. I unlocked my phone and tapped the voicemail icon, playing the most recent message on speaker. The audio filled the quiet cabin of my car. "Sarah, sweetheart, Roberts. voice echoed through the small space. His tone was jarringly soft, completely stripped of the arrogant venom he had used at the funeral reception just hours earlier. Listen, I know tensions were high today. Grief makes us all do things we regret. I was so out of line at the wake. I just got off the phone with my financial broker and, well, it really put things into perspective for me. I realized how much I truly miss your mother. I came to my senses. I just want her passbook back. It is a family keepsake. Give me a call the second you get this. We need to handle this together as a family. I deleted the message. I did not need to hear the rest to understand exactly what had happened. Bradley had warned me this would occur. The timeline had shifted at lightning speed. Robert had undoubtedly received a panic-inducing phone call from his mortgage broker. The private lenders he had used to secure his brand-new 6-bedroom mansion were demanding their collateral. The bank had officially refused to disburse any funds from my mother's account because the physical passbook was missing and the sole beneficiary had not signed the release. The house of cards Robert had built on stolen money and forged medical documents was already violently swaying in the wind. He finally realized that the faded blue passbook he threw into the champagne ice bucket was not garbage. It was the only lifeline he had left to avoid total financial ruin. I grabbed my purse, locked my car, and walked toward the entrance of my apartment building. My steps were completely steady. I did not feel the lingering sadness of the funeral anymore. I felt an intense, sharp focus. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my floor, my mind already calculating the next necessary steps to protect myself. I walked down the narrow carpeted hallway toward my unit. The moment I turned the corner, my blood ran completely cold. Standing directly in front of my apartment door were Robert, Jessica, and Chloe. They had not even bothered to change out of their expensive funeral clothes. Robert was pacing back and forth, running a hand through his hair with frantic, aggressive energy. Jessica was chewing on her perfectly manicured thumbnail, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her chest. Chloe was leaning against the wall, furiously typing on her smartphone. They looked entirely out of place in my modest, affordable housing complex, but they brought their overwhelming toxic presence right to my doorstep. I stopped at the end of the hallway. I could have turned around. I could have walked back down the stairs and driven away until they gave up and left. But I was done running from them. I had spent 16 years avoiding my father's shadow. I was not going to let him chase me away from my own home. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and walked directly toward them. As my shoes clicked against the floorboards beneath the thin carpet, Robert's head snapped up. His eyes locked onto me, and for a fraction of a second, I saw pure, unadulterated panic in his expression. But he was a master manipulator. In the blink of an eye, he smoothed his features into a mask of desperate manufactured affection. "Sarah," he exclaimed, rushing forward with his arms wide open as if he intended to hug me. "Thank God you are here. We have been waiting for 20 minutes. I took a sharp step back, putting a safe distance between us. "Do not touch me, Robert," I said, my voice low and firm. "What are you doing at my apartment?" Robert's fake smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly forced it back into place. "Now, Sarah, let us not be like this. I told you on the voicemails. I was completely out of line today. Losing your mother, it has just been so hard on me. I am not thinking straight. I just came to get her passbook. You know how much she meant to me. I need it for sentimental reasons." I stared at him, feeling a wave of absolute disgust wash over me. He was standing there in a custom suit, paid for by fraudulent loans, pretending to mourn a woman he had emotionally tortured for 3 decades. "Sentimental reasons," I repeated, keeping my tone completely flat. "You threw it into a bucket of melting ice 2 hours ago. You called it trash. You laughed in my face and told me she died a penniless loser." Jessica stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply. "Sarah, please try to be reasonable," she said, putting on her best soothing tone. "Your father is grieving. We are all grieving. We are supposed to be moving into our beautiful new home next week, and this tension is just ruining the experience. Hand over the passbook and we can all move on. You do not need an old piece of cardboard cluttering up your tiny apartment anyway." Chloe rolled her eyes and crossed her arms over her chest. Seriously, Sarah? Just give it to him, she scoffed. You are being completely dramatic. Dad said there is only $50 in it anyway, so why are you acting like it is a big deal? Just hand it over so we can go to dinner. I am starving. I looked at the three of them. They were a perfect triangle of greed and entitlement. They had absolutely no idea that I had already been to the bank. They had no idea that I had spoken to Manager Bradley and uncovered the entire fraudulent scheme. They truly believed I was just an ignorant, grieving daughter holding on to a piece of wet cardboard. I do not have it, I said, looking directly into Robert's eyes. And even if I did, I would never give it to you. The temperature in this hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees instantly. The fake, benevolent smile completely vanished from Robert's face, replaced by a dark, twisting rage that I remembered all too well from my childhood. The man who had gently asked for a memento just seconds ago was entirely gone. The real Robert Myers had finally arrived. What do you mean you do not have it? Robert demanded, his voice dropping into a dangerous, threatening growl. He took a heavy step toward me, using his physical size to try and intimidate me, just like he had always done to my mother. Do not play games with me, you ungrateful little brat. I know you fished it out of that bucket. I saw you walk out with it. Hand it over right now. I stood my ground, holding my purse tightly against my side. I told you to leave, I said. You have no right to be here. I reached into my purse and wrapped my fingers around my apartment keys. I quickly stepped past him, sliding the key into the deadbolt and unlocking my door in one swift motion. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, turning immediately to block the entrance before any of them could try to force their way in. Robert slammed his hand against the outside of the door frame, stopping me from closing it entirely. His face was mere inches from mine, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate fury. You listen to me, you pathetic excuse for a daughter. Robert spat his breath, smelling of expensive scotch and raw panic. That passbook belongs to me. Everything your mother owned belongs to me. I am her husband. I am the legal head of this family. You are going to give me that book right now, or I swear to God I will make your life a living hell. I did not push the door shut. I left it open just a crack wide enough to see his face, and more importantly wide enough for the microphone on my phone to pick up every single word he was saying. I slipped my free hand into my purse, unlocked my phone screen, and blindly tapped the voice memo app. I hit the record button and let the phone rest near the top of my bag. You have no legal right to anything she left me, Robert, I said, keeping my voice exceptionally calm, deliberately provoking him to speak more clearly. I have every legal right, Robert roared, his voice echoing down the quiet apartment hallway. It is marital property. Do you hear me? Marital property. You are stealing from me. I have millions of dollars tied up in a real estate deal that closes on Tuesday. If I do not have the funds from that trust account to satisfy my private lenders, I will lose the mansion. I will lose everything. He was confessing. He was openly admitting to the entire scheme right there in the hallway. He was so blinded by his own rage and his desperate need to control me that he was handing me all the evidence I would ever need to destroy him. That is your problem, I said, my voice completely steady. You took out fraudulent loans based on an account you did not control. That is fraud, Robert. Jessica pushed her way to the front, her face twisted into a vicious sneer. You little witch, she hissed, pointing a manicured finger at me through the crack in the door. You are doing this on purpose. You are just jealous because your father found someone younger and more beautiful than your miserable mother. You are trying to sabotage our new life out of pure spite. Chloe chimed in from the background, her voice dripping with venom. You are going to pay for this, Sarah. Dad has the best lawyers in the city. He is going to sue you into absolute poverty. You will not even be able to afford this dump of an apartment by the time we are done with you. Robert slammed his fist against the wooden doorframe, making the entire wall shake. I am giving you one last warning, Sarah, he growled, leaning in so close I could see the veins bulging in his neck. You will sign that money over to me. I will drag you through probate court. I will file theft charges against you. I will tie you up in so much litigation that you will be begging me to take that passbook off your hands. You are nothing. You have always been nothing. You are going to hand over that account, or I will personally see to it that you end up sleeping on the streets again." I let the silence hang for a moment, making sure the recording app captured the heavy, threatening quiet that followed his outburst. I looked at the man who had terrorized my mother for 30 years. I looked at the man who had thrown me away like garbage. He was not a terrifying giant anymore. He was just a desperate, pathetic criminal who was entirely out of options. I shifted my weight and looked right into his angry, panicked eyes. "Are you quite finished?" I asked, my tone completely devoid of any emotion. Robert blinked, caught entirely off guard by my absolute lack of fear. "What did you just say?" I said, "Are you finished?" I repeated, speaking slowly and clearly. "Because if you are done threatening me, I am going to close my door now. And if you or your fiancée or her daughter ever set foot on my property again, I will not hesitate to call the police and have you all arrested for trespassing and harassment." "You would not dare," Robert sneered, though a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed his face. "Try me," I said. I placed both my hands flat against the heavy wooden door. Robert glared at me for one long, agonizing second, trying to assert dominance through sheer intimidation. But I did not look away. I did not blink. I stared him down with the absolute confidence of a woman who knew she held all the cards. Slowly, Robert pulled his hand back from the doorframe. He took a step back, his chest heaving with exertion. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "This is not over, Sarah," he warned, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "You are going to regret this." I slammed the door shut in his face. The sound echoed through my small apartment like a gunshot. I quickly turned the deadbolt, engaged the chain lock, and slid the security bar into place. I stood with my back pressed against the solid wood, listening to the muffled sounds of their footsteps retreating down the hallway. I heard Jessica complaining loudly about her shoes, and Robert cursing under his breath as they made their way toward the stairs. I waited until the hallway was completely silent, before I finally let out a long, shaky breath. The adrenaline was pumping through my veins, making my hands tremble slightly. I reached into my purse and pulled out my cell phone. I looked at the screen. The voice memo app was still running, the red digital timer ticking past the 4-minute mark. I hit the stop button and saved the audio file. I immediately uploaded it to a secure cloud server and emailed a backup copy directly to my personal inbox. I walked into my small living room and sat down on the edge of the sofa. I was exhausted. The emotional toll of burying my mother, enduring the horrific display at the reception, discovering a multi-million-dollar secret, and facing down my father's violent ambush had drained almost every ounce of energy from my body. But as I sat there in the quiet safety of my apartment, holding the phone that contained the undeniable proof of his extortion, a profound sense of clarity washed over me. Robert thought he could still control me with threats and intimidation. He thought he could bully me into submission, just like he had done when I was a child. He thought I was weak, but he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to finalize his destruction. He had openly admitted to desperately needing the trust funds to cover his shady real estate transactions. He had clearly threatened to destroy me if I did not comply. I had his entire hostile extortion attempt recorded in crystal-clear, high-definition audio. I set the phone down on the coffee table next to the damp blue passbook I had pulled from my purse. The next morning, I was going to take this recording straight to Jonathan Sterling, the most ruthless estate attorney in the city. We were going to analyze every single word Robert had said. We were going to map out exactly how deep his financial fraud went. We were going to build a trap so perfectly disguised that my father would walk right into it with a smile on his face. I leaned back against the sofa cushions and closed my eyes. The war had officially begun, but for the first time in my entire life, I was the one dictating the terms of engagement. My mother had given me the shield, and my father had just handed me the sword. I did not sleep at all that night. I sat on my faded living room sofa, watching the morning light slowly creep across my ceiling. The cell phone in my hand felt incredibly heavy. I had spent the past 8 hours listening to the audio recording of my father shouting through my apartment door. I listened to his frantic, angry threats over and over again. I heard the sheer panic in his voice when he demanded the passbook. I heard Jessica and Chloe shouting their vicious insults from the hallway. In the past, a night like this would have left me completely broken. I would have cried until my eyes were swollen, asking myself why my own flesh and blood hated me so much. But the 13-year-old girl who used to cry on the front porch was gone. In her place was a 29-year-old woman who had just realized she held the key to a massive financial fortress. I knew that confronting Robert directly would be a massive mistake. He was a master manipulator who thrived on chaos and screaming matches. If I engaged with him on his level, he would find a way to twist the narrative and make himself the victim. I needed to be entirely cold and precise. I needed legal firepower. At exactly 8 a.m, I picked up my phone and called the office of Jonathan Sterling. Jonathan was one of the most ruthless and respected probate and estate attorneys in the entire city. I had spent the early hours of the morning researching lawyers who specialized in complex trust litigation and financial fraud. Jonathan's name kept appearing at the top of every list. He was expensive, and he was known for destroying people who tried to steal from his clients. That was exactly what I needed. I explained the situation to his intake paralegal, mentioning the multi-million-dollar Totten Trust and the ongoing fraud attempts. Within 20 minutes, Jonathan himself called me back and told me to come to his office immediately. His office was located in a sleek glass building in the financial district. It smelled of rich leather and fresh coffee. Jonathan Sterling was a tall man with silver hair and sharp, calculating eyes. He did not waste time with empty apologies about my mother's passing. He shook my hand, offered me a seat, and asked me to lay out exactly what I knew. I handed him the damp blue passbook and the financial summaries that Manager Bradley had printed out for me at the bank. Then I placed my phone on his mahogany desk and played the audio recording from the hallway. Jonathan sat perfectly still, listening to Robert scream through the door. He listened to my father openly admit to taking out private loans based on an account he did not control. He listened to the threats of frivolous lawsuits and forced poverty. When the recording finally ended, Jonathan leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers. A cold professional smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Your father is a very loud, very foolish man," Jonathan said quietly. "He has just handed us the rope to hang him with. But before we take any action, we need to know exactly how deep his financial crimes go. We need to see the entire board before we make our first move." I formally retained Jonathan as my legal counsel right there on the spot. Because I was the sole named beneficiary of the Totten Trust, and I had my mother's official death certificate, Jonathan had the legal authority to launch a comprehensive investigation into her financial history. We did not wait. Jonathan immediately brought in a forensic accountant from his firm to start digging through public records, property deeds, and credit histories. What we uncovered over the next 48 hours was a truth so utterly disgusting it made me physically sick to my stomach. We sat in Jonathan's conference room, surrounded by stacks of financial documents and printed credit reports. The forensic accountant had pulled my mother's complete credit history using her Social Security number. My mother had always lived incredibly modestly. She never had a credit card of her own because Robert completely controlled the household finances. For decades, her credit report had been entirely blank. But 3 months ago, right around the time my mother was moved into the oncology ward, her credit profile suddenly exploded. "Look at these dates," Jonathan said, pointing to a spreadsheet with the tip of his silver pen. "Your mother was admitted to the hospital on October 12th. She was heavily medicated on strong painkillers and largely unresponsive. On October 15th, someone used her Social Security number to apply for a platinum tier credit card. On October 18th, another application was filed for a high-limit personal loan. Over the next month, a total of 14 different credit lines were opened in her name. My hands trembled as I looked at the pages. "He stole her identity," I whispered, feeling a wave of absolute revulsion wash over me. While she was lying in a hospital bed fighting for her life, he was stealing her Social Security number. "He did more than just steal it," Jonathan said, his voice completely flat. "He maxed out every single one of these accounts. He took out what we call junk credit loans. These are high-interest, unsecured personal loans that approve almost anyone with a clean credit history. Because your mother had zero debt, her credit score was an untouched blank slate. Your father exploited that clean slate to borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars. I scanned the itemized credit card statements that the accountant had managed to pull. The purchases were sickening. There were massive charges from high-end luxury boutiques. There were receipts for a $50,000 diamond engagement ring from an exclusive jeweler downtown. There were charges for extravagant spa weekends, five-star hotel stays, and expensive dinners at restaurants my mother had never once been allowed to step foot in. He was funding their lifestyle, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He was using my dying mother's stolen identity to buy diamonds for Jessica. He was paying for Chloe's designer handbags and luxury vacations, using money borrowed in the name of the woman he was burying. It was the ultimate betrayal. Robert had not just waited for my mother to die. He had actively robbed her while she was taking her final breaths. He had used the woman he spent 30 years calling worthless to finance a lavish fantasy life for his new mistress and her spoiled daughter. But the junk credit cards were only the beginning of the nightmare. The forensic accountant had also pulled the deed and mortgage records for the sprawling 6-bedroom mansion Robert had been boasting about at the funeral reception. This is where your father crosses the line from petty theft into major federal crimes, Jonathan explained, tapping a thick legal document. This is the loan agreement for his new estate. He did not use a traditional bank for this mortgage because a traditional bank would have required a rigorous background check and proof of liquid assets. Instead, he went to a private lending syndicate. These groups offer massive short-term loans, but they require absolute proof of collateral. Jonathan turned to the next page, revealing a forged financial statement. Your father presented this private lending group with forged documents, claiming he had joint access to the Totten Trust, Jonathan said. He somehow discovered the existence of the trust, likely by intercepting old tax documents your mother tried to hide. He told the lenders that the trust was marital property. He signed a legally binding affidavit stating that upon his wife's imminent passing, the $6.8 million would immediately transfer to his control. Based on that fraudulent promise, the lenders gave him a bridge loan to purchase the mansion and the luxury cars. I stared at the forged signature on the affidavit. He really believed the money would automatically go to him, I said, shaking my head. He was so incredibly arrogant that he spent the money before he even knew the rules of the trust. Exactly, Jonathan said, leaning forward. But a bridge loan has a very specific structure. It is designed to bridge the gap between an immediate purchase and an expected influx of cash. The terms of this loan are brutal. According to the contract, your father has to make a massive balloon payment to the lenders within 30 days of your mother's passing. If he fails to produce the funds, the lenders have the right to immediately seize the property, seize the vehicles, and freeze all of his personal assets. The pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking together perfectly in my mind. This was why Robert had been so frantic outside my apartment door. This was why he had staged that entire performance at the funeral to make himself look wealthy and powerful. He was trying to maintain a facade of absolute control while secretly drowning in a sea of toxic debt. He needed that passbook. He needed my signature to release the trust funds so he could pay off the predatory lenders before they realized he had committed massive financial fraud. We have him, Jonathan said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. What your father has done constitutes multiple counts of federal identity theft, wire fraud, and mortgage fraud. He used the United States postal system and digital wire transfers to secure loans under false pretenses. The moment those lenders realize the collateral is fake, they will not just evict him. They will hand this entire file over to the federal authorities. I looked at the mountain of evidence spread across the conference table. For 15 years, I had believed that Robert Myers was an untouchable force of nature. I had believed he was a towering figure of authority who could crush anyone who crossed him. But looking at the messy, desperate paper trail he had left behind, I realized he was nothing but a reckless coward. He had built his entire life on intimidation and lies. What is our next move? I asked, looking directly into Jonathan's eyes. Do we report him to the police right now? Do we hand this over to the authorities? Jonathan slowly shook his head, a brilliant calculating light shining in his eyes. If we report him right now, he might have time to scramble. He might try to hide assets or hire a defense attorney to delay the process. We do not want to give him time to breathe. We want to trap him in a corner where he has absolutely no way out. Jonathan pulled a fresh legal document from his briefcase. It was a formal directive addressed to the regional bank. "We are going to trigger a permanent freeze on the Totten Trust," Jonathan explained. "You are the sole legal beneficiary. You are going to sign a directive instructing the bank to officially lock the account and deny any and all third-party inquiries. When your father attempts to contact the bank again to stall for time or demand the funds, the bank will be legally obligated to issue him a formal rejection notice. They will officially inform him that the funds have been permanently secured by the rightful heir and he has zero legal access." I listened closely, my heart pounding with a steady, rhythmic intensity. "When your father receives that official rejection," Jonathan continued, his voice dropping to a low, serious pitch, "he will be forced to realize that the game is completely over. But more importantly, the private lenders are monitoring the situation. The moment the bank officially rejects his claim, those lenders will receive an automatic notification that the collateral backing their massive bridge loan does not exist." Jonathan tapped his silver pen against the desk for emphasis. "The very second that happens, Robert will enter immediate default. The lending syndicate will trigger a financial chain reaction that your father cannot stop. They will seize the mansion. They will repossess the luxury cars. They will liquidate every single personal bank account attached to his name to recover their losses. And when they realize the depth of the forgery, they will send their own attorneys straight to the federal prosecutor's office." "How long will it take?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm. Jonathan smiled a cold, sharp smile. "From the moment we file this permanent freeze directive, the entire domino effect will take exactly 7 days. Within 1 week, your father's entire financial existence will collapse into absolute ruin." I stared down at the directive paper sitting on the polished mahogany table. I thought about the cruel text messages Jessica had sent my mother over the years, mocking her for wearing cheap clothes. I thought about Chloe laughing hysterically at the funeral, waving the passbook in the air like it was a hilarious joke. I thought about my father throwing my belongings in garbage bags, standing on the porch, and telling me I was no longer part of his family. They had taken everything from my mother. They had stripped her of her dignity, her peace of mind, and ultimately her very identity while she was dying in a hospital bed. They thought they had gotten away with the perfect crime. They thought they could dance on her grave and walk away millions of dollars richer. I picked up the heavy silver pen from the desk. I did not feel an ounce of hesitation or guilt. I felt the powerful, righteous weight of absolute justice. I pressed the tip of the pen to the paper and signed my full legal name in dark, flowing ink. I pushed the signed document back across the table to Jonathan. "File it," I said, my voice ringing with total conviction. "Freeze the trust. Let the clock start ticking." Jonathan took the paper and slid it into his briefcase, snapping the brass lock shut with a sharp, definitive sound. "Consider it done, Sarah. The bank will process this directive by the end of the business day. Your father has exactly 1 week left of pretending to be a king before his entire castle burns to the ground." I walked out of Jonathan's office and took the elevator down to the busy Seattle street. The rain had finally stopped, and the afternoon sun was breaking through the gray clouds, casting a bright golden light over the city. I walked toward my car, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over my shoulders. I was not going to hide anymore. I was not going to make myself small. I had unearthed the deep, disgusting black hole of my father's financial crimes, and I had just lit the match that would destroy it all. I knew that Robert would become completely unhinged when the default notices started rolling in. I knew that Jessica and Chloe would panic when their luxury fantasies started evaporating right in front of their eyes. But I was ready for them. I had the truth. I had the law on my side. And I had a 7-day countdown running in the background, quietly ticking away the final moments of Robert Meyer's fake, pathetic empire. The trap was perfectly set, and all I had to do now was wait for the dominoes to fall. The very next morning, the heavy gray clouds over the city had finally broken, letting a harsh, bright light spill across the downtown financial district. I walked into Jonathan Sterling's office feeling an entirely new kind of energy humming in my veins. I was no longer operating out of fear. I was operating out of absolute precision. Manager Bradley was already sitting at the mahogany conference table with a thick stack of banking regulations spread out in front of him. We had spent the entire weekend unearthing the massive black hole of my father's financial crimes. Now it was time to build the trap that would bury him in it. I sat down at the table and looked at the two men who had become my greatest allies in this fight. Jonathan folded his hands together and leaned forward, his sharp eyes locked onto mine. He told me that we had a choice to make. We could simply file the paperwork to freeze the trust block my father out completely and let his private lenders slowly tear him apart over the next few months. It would be quiet. It would be safe. But Jonathan knew that a quiet bankruptcy was not what Robert Myers deserved. My father was a man who thrived on public intimidation. He had spent his entire life making my mother feel small in front of other people. He had thrown me out onto the street like a bag of garbage and laughed about it in front of his wealthy friends. A silent financial failure would give him the opportunity to spin the narrative. He would play the victim. He would tell his country club associates that he was ruined by a bad market or a dishonest broker. We could not let him do that. We needed to expose him so completely that he could never rewrite the story. Bradley agreed. He pointed out that if we simply locked the account today, Robert would immediately realize he was cornered. Desperate men who know they have nothing left to lose will either run away or act out in unpredictable violence. We needed to keep him anchored to his own greed. We needed to keep him perfectly distracted until the exact moment his entire life collapsed. That was when we devised the legal net. Instead of issuing a permanent freeze directive right away, we decided to use the bank's own bureaucratic protocols as a weapon. Bradley explained that the bank had a standard procedure for disputed high-value trusts. We were going to draft a highly official document called a signature verification notice and send it directly to Robert's new mansion via certified mail. Jonathan spent the next hour carefully crafting the language of that notice. It was a masterpiece of legal misdirection. The document officially stated that the bank had received his numerous demands for the release of the Taunton Trust funds. It went on to explain that due to the specific bylaws of the account, the bank could not process any disbursement or transfer without the verified physical signature of the named beneficiary on a relinquishment form. To a rational human being, the notice clearly meant that I had absolute control over the money and that the bank would not bypass my authority. But Robert was not a rational human being. He was a textbook narcissist drowning in millions of dollars of fraudulent debt. He only heard what he wanted to hear. Jonathan knew exactly how my father would interpret that letter. Robert would read those words and believe that the bank was finally yielding to his demands. He would believe that the only obstacle standing between him and $6.8 million was my signature. He is going to think he has won. Jonathan said, a cold, satisfied smile touching his lips. He is going to look at this notice and believe that all he has to do is intimidate you into signing a piece of paper. He will think the money is practically already in his pocket. It will keep him completely focused on bullying you instead of preparing for the private lenders who are about to foreclose on his stolen mansion. While the bait was being printed and mailed, I had to ensure that my mother's legacy was absolutely untouchable. I rode the elevator down to the ground floor and walked 2 blocks over to Bradley's bank branch. We bypassed the public lobby and went straight into his secure private office. It was time to take official control of the funds. Bradley placed a stack of heavy watermarked documents on his desk. These were not the simple withdrawal slips I was used to seeing. These were executive-level transfer authorizations. As I picked up the silver pen to sign my name, my hand hovered over the paper for a long moment. I thought about my mother. I thought about the decades she spent wearing threadbare coats and buying expired groceries, all while sitting on an absolute fortune. She had endured a life of manufactured misery just to build this shield for me. She had swallowed her pride every single day, so that one day I would never have to bow to anyone. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my full legal name. I signed page after page, legally dissolving the original Taunton Trust and transferring the entire balance of $6,842,000 into a newly established private wealth management account. Bradley assured me that this new account was an impenetrable fortress. It was secured behind multi-factor authentication and biometric locks. My father could hire the most aggressive litigation team in the country, and they would not be able to so much as verify the account's existence without my physical presence and my fingerprint. The money was finally safe. My mother's sacrifice had not been in vain. But securing the money was only half the battle. Now I had to secure myself. When I returned to Jonathan's office, he sat me down for a very serious conversation about physical safety. We had just engineered a situation where Robert would believe that forcing me to sign a document was the key to his survival. My father had already proven he was capable of violence when he ambushed me at my apartment door. When the pressure from his predatory lenders started to mount, his desperation would quickly turn dangerous. I was no longer dealing with a loud, angry bully. I was dealing with a criminal who was backed into a corner. "You cannot go back to your apartment unescorted," Jonathan warned me, his tone entirely serious. "Your father knows where you live. He knows you live alone. When he receives that signature notice, he will come looking for you. We need to make sure that when he finds you, he realizes you are completely out of his league." Jonathan picked up his phone and made a call to a private security firm he frequently used for his high-net-worth clients. He explained the situation, outlining the potential threat level of a desperate man facing federal fraud charges. Within 2 hours, the head of the security detail arrived at Jonathan's office. His name was David. He was a former military contractor who ran a highly specialized team of protection agents. He did not look like a stereotypical bouncing nightclub guard. He wore a tailored suit and carried himself with a quiet, unassuming professionalism. David listened as Jonathan and I detailed my father's history of aggression and the massive financial stakes involved. "We do not want a visible display of force," I explained to David. "I do not want my father to know I am actively protecting myself. I want him to approach me thinking I am exactly the same terrified 13-year-old girl he threw out on the street. I need him to feel overconfident right up until the trap snaps shut." David nodded, understanding the assignment perfectly. He assigned 2 of his best undercover operatives to me immediately. They would operate as a shadow detail. One agent would be stationed in an unmarked car outside my apartment complex, tracking anyone who tried to approach my building. The second agent would pose as my personal driver and associate, as staying within 20 feet of me at all times when I was out in public. They were equipped with concealed communications and were fully briefed on my father's appearance and the specific vehicles driven by Jessica and Chloe. For the first time in my life, I felt a profound sense of physical security. Growing up in my parents' house, I was always looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next explosion, waiting for the next cruel insult or sudden punishment. Even after Uncle Harold took me in, the ghost of my father's, rage had always lingered in the back of my mind. But sitting in that office, surrounded by a top-tier legal strategist, a dedicated financial manager, and a team of elite security professionals, I finally realized my own power. I was no longer the spare child. I was a woman holding all the cards, and I was perfectly protected. With my safety secured and the money locked away, Jonathan and I turned our attention to the final phase of the plan. We needed the perfect stage to execute the counterattack. We knew that Robert was a man obsessed with appearances. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of wealth and success. He had stolen my mother's identity to buy diamonds and luxury cars just to impress people who did not actually care about him. If we simply let the police arrest him at his office on a random Tuesday, it would not deliver the justice my mother deserved. We needed to dismantle his fake empire in front of the exact audience he was trying to impress. Elena, my best friend and HR director back at my company, had been keeping a close eye on the social media accounts of Jessica and Chloe. They were not discreet people. They practically broadcasted their entire lives to the internet, hungry for validation and envy from their followers. Elena brought her laptop into the conference room and pulled up Chloe's latest public posts. There it was, the perfect opportunity. Chloe had posted a digital invitation dripping with gold foil graphics and pretentious cursive fonts. Robert and Jessica were hosting a massive engagement gala that coming Saturday night. They were throwing the party at the sprawling 6-bedroom mansion Robert had fraudulently purchased using my mother's stolen identity. The guest list included over 100 of the city's most prominent business owners, local politicians, and wealthy socialites. It was meant to be Robert's crowning achievement. It was his grand debut into the upper echelons of society, paid for entirely with fake loans and stolen credit. "He is throwing a coronation for himself," Jonathan said, staring at the screen with absolute disgust. "He is going to stand in that stolen house drinking expensive champagne and pretend he built an empire." I looked at the date on the invitation. Saturday night. It aligned perfectly with our timeline. By Friday afternoon, the private lending syndicate would realize that the balloon payment on the mansion was not coming. They would discover that the Totten Trust collateral was completely inaccessible. They would immediately initiate the foreclosure and alert the federal authorities about the identity theft and mortgage fraud. The wheels of justice would already be turning before the first guest even arrived at the party. "I am going to that gala," I said, my voice steady and resolute. Jonathan looked at me and a slow, sharp smile spread across his face. "He wants you there anyway," he pointed out. "He thinks you are going to show up to surrender. He thinks he can drag you into a back room during his party, intimidate you one last time, and force you to sign away the money so he can cover his tracks. Then we will give him exactly what he wants," I said. "We will let him invite me in. We will let him gather his entire network of wealthy friends to witness his great triumph. And then we are going to drop the floor right out from under him." The plan was set. We spent the rest of the afternoon refining every single detail. My undercover security detail would accompany me to the mansion posing as my personal entourage. Jonathan would attend as my legal counsel carrying the undeniable proof of my father's federal crimes in his briefcase. We would not sneak in the back door. We would walk right through the front gates and face him under the crystal chandeliers he bought with my mother's suffering. I left the financial district that evening feeling an incredible sense of purpose. I rode in the back of the sleek black sedan, driven by my new security agent, watching the city lights blur past the rain-slicked windows. I thought about the worn blue passbook, now safely locked inside a bank vault. I thought about my mother quietly enduring years of pain so that I could one day sit in the back of this car completely safe and financially untouchable. My father had spent his entire life treating us like we were absolutely worthless. He had thrown me out onto a dark porch with 2 garbage bags and told me I was no longer his daughter. He was about to learn that throwing away his daughter was the most expensive mistake he would ever make. I leaned back against the leather seat and watched the city roll by, counting down the days until Saturday night. The legal net had been perfectly laid out, and Robert Myers was already walking straight into it. The afternoon sun was casting long, heavy shadows across the worn carpet of my living room. I sat perfectly still on my second-hand sofa holding my cell phone in my lap. The silence in my apartment was profound. It was the kind of deep, thick silence that always precedes a massive storm. For the past 24 hours, I had been waiting. Jonathan Sterling had assured me that the certified letter from the bank, the signature verification notice designed specifically to trigger my father's immense ego, had been delivered to the new mansion that morning. We had cast the legal net. Now all I had to do was wait for the prey to take the bait. My phone vibrated violently against my palm, shattering the quiet atmosphere of the room. The bright screen illuminated, displaying a caller ID that made my pulse quicken. It was not Robert. It was Chloe. I stared at the glowing screen for 3 long rings. This was the moment. This was the psychological chess match Jonathan and I had meticulously prepared for. I needed to play the role of the defeated, terrified daughter. I needed to give them the absolute illusion of total victory. I took a deep breath, forced my muscles to relax, and pressed the green button to accept the call. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice quiet and hesitant. Well, if it is not the little thief," Chloe sneered, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. Her tone was shrill and piercing, echoing through the small speaker of my phone. I could hear a tremendous amount of background noise behind her. There were voices shouting directions, the clinking of heavy glassware, and the sound of furniture being dragged across hardwood floors. It sounded like a massive production crew was currently tearing through their house. "I am not a thief, Chloe," I replied, making sure my voice sounded small and defensive. "I just went to the bank to see what my mother left me." "You and Robert are the ones who threw it away." Chloe let out a loud, dramatic sigh, as if my very existence was a massive inconvenience to her day. "Oh, please, Sarah. Save the pathetic victim act for someone who actually cares. Nobody is buying it anymore. We all know exactly what you are trying to do. You are trying to steal Robert's money to ruin our engagement party. But it is not going to work. Dad is way smarter than you will ever be." I closed my eyes and pictured her standing in that stolen mansion, completely oblivious to the massive financial crater opening up beneath her feet. "Engagement party?" I asked, allowing a slight tremble into my voice. "Of course the engagement party," Chloe bragged, her voice rising with arrogant pride. "It is happening this Saturday night, and it is going to be the social event of the entire year. Dad is pulling out all the stops for my mother. We have imported champagne flowing from Crystal Towers. We have a 5-star catering team setting up a carving station in the grand dining room. There are going to be over 100 important wealthy guests walking through our front doors. It is a completely lavish, beautiful lifestyle, and you are just rotting away in your tiny, depressing apartment trying to ruin our happiness." I gripped the edge of my sofa cushion. The sheer audacity of her words was almost suffocating. They were throwing a massive, extravagant gala to celebrate their fake love using the stolen identity of my dead mother to finance the entire charade. They were drinking imported champagne while my mother's ashes were barely cold. "It is not your money," I said, forcing my breathing to sound shallow and erratic. "That trust account belongs to me. The bank manager told me it was in my name." Chloe laughed. It was a cruel, harsh sound that grated against my ears. "You really are completely stupid, Sarah. Do you honestly think a major bank is going to hand over nearly $7 million to a miserable nobody like you? Dad just got the official notice from the bank directors this morning. He showed it to his lawyers. The bank clearly stated that they cannot release those marital funds to him until you sign a formal relinquishment document. That is the only reason your name is even involved. You are just a clerical error, Sarah. You are a bureaucratic speed bump." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from smiling. Jonathan Sterling was an absolute genius. The signature verification notice had worked flawlessly. Robert had read the formal banking language, and his towering narcissism had completely warped reality. He genuinely believed that the bank recognized the money as his marital property, and that they were simply waiting for me to sign away my beneficiary rights to close the file. He had swallowed the bait whole, and he had convinced Jessica and Chloe of his absolute victory. "He cannot make me sign anything," I whispered, making sure I sounded on the verge of tears. "I will not do it. That was my mother's final gift to me." "You do not have a choice, you idiot," Chloe snapped, her voice turning vicious and threatening. "Dad is done playing nice with you. He told me to call you and deliver a message. He said that if you do not sign those relinquishment papers, he's going to unleash hell on you. He is going to use the trust funds to pay off the mortgage on this beautiful new mansion anyway. But before he does that, he's going to file a massive federal lawsuit against you for the theft of marital property." I remained silent, letting her fill the quiet space with her venom. "He is going to freeze your bank accounts," Chloe continued, her tone filled with sadistic delight. "He is going to send his private attorneys after you until you are completely bankrupt. You will not even be able to afford the rent on that disgusting little apartment of yours. Get ready to move out, Sarah, because Dad is going to put you right back out on the street where you belong. You are going to be completely homeless and nobody is going to care." The psychological manipulation was incredibly intense. If I had not spent the entire weekend looking at the undeniable proof of Robert's massive financial fraud, I might have actually believed her. I might have reverted back to that terrified 13-year-old girl who thought her father was an invincible monster. But I knew the truth. I knew that Robert did not have high-powered attorneys waiting in the wings. He had predatory private lenders breathing down his neck, demanding a balloon payment he absolutely could not afford. The threats Chloe was screaming into the phone were nothing but empty, desperate air. "Please," I said, letting my voice crack perfectly. "Please, Chloe. You have to tell him to stop. I cannot afford to fight a big lawsuit. I do not have any money for lawyers. Please just tell him to leave me alone." I poured every ounce of fake desperation I could muster into those words. I practically begged her. I needed them to believe that their intimidation tactics had completely broken my spirit. Chloe scoffed loudly. "I am not telling him anything. You did this to yourself, Sarah. You should have just left the garbage in the trash where it belonged." "Wait," I cried out, acting frantic and defeated. "Wait. What if we negotiate? What if I sign the papers?" The line went completely quiet for 3 seconds. The background noise of the party planners faded slightly. I had her full attention. "What did you just say?" Chloe asked, her tone shifting from aggressive to suspicious. "I am not a fighter," I whispered, sniffing loudly into the receiver. "I cannot handle going to court. I just want to be left alone. If I bring the passbook to the party on Saturday, can we just talk about this privately? If I sign the relinquishment forms, will he agree to drop the lawsuits? Maybe he could just give me a small portion of the money to help me pay my rent. Just a tiny fraction of it so I can survive. We can renegotiate the terms." I held my breath, waiting for her response. This was the absolute crux of the trap. I was offering them a complete, unconditional surrender. I was volunteering to walk directly into the lion's den on the night of their greatest triumph to hand over the keys to the kingdom. "Hold on," Chloe muttered. I heard the phone rustle against her clothing as she covered the receiver. The audio was muffled, but I could faintly hear her shouting for Robert. I heard the heavy thud of footsteps approaching. I heard low, urgent whispers exchanged between them. They were discussing my total surrender. They were celebrating my submission. A moment later, the phone was picked back up. The voice on the other end was no longer Chloe's shrill pitch. It was the deep, arrogant, incredibly smug voice of my father. "Well, Sarah," Robert said, his tone dripping with fake magnanimity and supreme confidence. "Chloe tells me that you have finally decided to use that small brain of yours. It is about time you stopped throwing these ridiculous tantrums and started acting like an adult." I stared at the wall of my apartment, my expression completely cold and emotionless, even as I kept my voice weak and trembling. "I just do not want any more trouble, Robert. I cannot handle a lawsuit. I will bring the passbook. I just want to negotiate a small settlement so I can move on with my life." "There will be no negotiating," Robert stated firmly, shutting down my fake request with absolute authority. "You are in no position to demand anything from me. But because I am a generous man and because your mother would have wanted me to show you some mercy, I will agree to call off my attorneys. I will cancel the marital theft charges. You will come to the engagement gala this Saturday evening. You will arrive exactly at 8 o'clock. I will be there, I promised, sounding thoroughly defeated. I will have my personal legal team draft the formal relinquishment documents." Robert continued, his arrogance expanding with every word. "They will be sitting on the desk in my private study. You will walk in, you will hand over the blue passbook, and you will sign the documents unconditionally transferring all rights of the Totten Trust directly to me. Once you sign the papers, I will write you a personal check for $10,000 to help you with your little apartment rent. And then you will leave my property and never contact this family again. Do we have an understanding?" $10,000. Out of nearly $7 million, he was offering me a pathetic $10,000 bribe to walk away from my own legacy. He truly believed he was a master negotiator. He truly believed he had completely outsmarted the entire banking system and terrified his daughter into total submission. "Yes, Robert," I whispered. "We have an understanding. I will bring the passbook on Saturday." "Good." Robert said, a cruel, self-satisfied chuckle escaping his lips. "Wear something decent for once in your life, Sarah. I have very important guests arriving, and I will not have you looking like a homeless beggar on my front steps. See you on Saturday." The line clicked and went dead. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear. The digital call timer disappeared from the screen, leaving only my dark reflection staring back at me. I did not move for a long time. I sat in the heavy silence of my living room, feeling the deep, rhythmic pounding of my heart against my ribs. I had done it. The performance was flawless. The bait had been completely swallowed without a single second of hesitation. Robert was now so entirely consumed by the illusion of his impending victory that he would not look twice at the looming disaster approaching from his private lenders. He believed that Saturday night would be his ultimate coronation. He believed he would stand in front of the city's elite, celebrate his new marriage, and secure $7 million with the simple stroke of a pen. He was going to spend the next 2 days furiously preparing for a party that was destined to become his own funeral. He was going to hire lawyers to draft fake relinquishment documents, wasting even more borrowed money on a legal fantasy. He was completely trapped in his own web of arrogance and greed. A slow, genuine smile finally broke across my face. The sheer psychological relief of knowing that I was no longer the victim was intoxicating. For my entire childhood, I had cowered in the corners of our house, terrified of Robert's booming voice and his unpredictable rage. I had watched my mother shrink herself down to nothing just to survive his constant emotional violence. We had both been prisoners to his delusions of grandeur, but not anymore. I stood up from the sofa and walked over to the small table by the window. I picked up the business card Jonathan Sterling had given me. I needed to call him and confirm that the timeline was perfectly on track. I needed to coordinate the final logistics with David and my undercover security detail. I had a lot of preparations to make before Saturday night. I had to pick out the perfect outfit. Robert had demanded that I wear something decent so I would not embarrass him in front of his wealthy country club associates. I intended to follow that instruction very carefully. I was going to walk into that stolen mansion looking absolutely flawless. I was going to project the kind of quiet, undeniable power that money could never buy. I looked out the window at the bustling street below my apartment. The world was moving forward completely unaware of the massive collision course that was about to take place. My father thought he had intimidated me into surrendering my mother's legacy. He thought the legal threats and the cruel insults had broken my spirit. He had absolutely no idea that I had already permanently locked the account. He had no idea that his bridge loans were about to enter immediate catastrophic default. And he certainly had no idea that when I walked into his private study on Saturday night, I would not be holding a pen to sign his fake documents. I would be holding the hammer that was going to smash his entire fake life into a million irreparable pieces. I dialed Jonathan's number, listening to the phone ring as I stared out into the afternoon sunlight. The trap was perfectly set. The enemy was happily dancing inside the cage. All I had to do now was wait for the engagement party to begin. Saturday night arrived with a cool, crisp breeze that swept through the city streets. I sat in the spacious back seat of a sleek black town car, watching the glowing streetlights blur past the tinted windows. David, my undercover security operative, was behind the wheel, dressed in a sharp, dark suit that made him look exactly like a high-end private chauffeur. Next to me sat Jonathan Sterling, my attorney, his silver hair perfectly styled and his briefcase resting securely on his lap. We were heading straight into the wealthiest neighborhood in the county. We were driving toward the sprawling 6-bedroom mansion that Robert had fraudulently purchased using my late mother's stolen identity. I looked down at my hands. They were not shaking. I was wearing a floor-length midnight blue evening gown that was tailored to perfection. It was elegant, powerful, and sophisticated. It was not the cheap stained morning dress I had worn just a week ago when my father had humiliated me in front of his friends. This gown cost more than Robert had ever spent on me in my entire childhood, and it was paid for by the very first authorized withdrawal from my mother's secure private wealth account. I had spent 15 years making myself as small and invisible as possible, trying to avoid the wrath of a man who measured human worth strictly by financial status. Tonight I was not going to hide. I was going to walk into the absolute center of his world, and I was going to project the kind of quiet, undeniable power that fake money could never buy. David steered the town car onto a long, winding driveway lined with towering oak trees and manicured hedges. The estate was absolutely massive. It was a vulgar display of stolen wealth. Up ahead, I could see a team of professional valets in white shirts rushing to park a continuous stream of luxury vehicles. Porsches, Mercedes, and heavily customized SUVs were lined up along the circular driveway. Robert was truly throwing a coronation for himself. He had invited the absolute elite of the city, including bank executives, real estate developers, and local politicians, to witness his grand debut into high society. He wanted everyone to see how successful he was, completely unaware that his entire financial chain was scheduled to collapse in a matter of days. David parked the car near the grand entrance and quickly stepped out to open my door. I stepped out into the cool evening air. The sheer size of the mansion was intimidating with its massive stone columns and brilliantly lit windows, but I did not feel an ounce of fear. Jonathan stepped out of the car and adjusted his suit jacket. He gave me a brief, confident nod. We had gone over the plan a dozen times. David and another undercover operative would blend into the crowd, posing as part of my personal entourage, while Jonathan would remain strictly by my side as my legal counsel. We were not going to sneak through the back door. We were going to walk right through the front gates. I walked up the wide stone steps toward the heavy double doors. The entrance was flanked by massive floral arrangements of white roses and orchids. The moment I crossed the threshold, the sheer volume of the party washed over me. It was a lavish, extravagant affair that made my stomach churn with pure disgust. A professional string quartet was playing a lively classical arrangement in the corner of the grand hall. Waiters in crisp black uniforms circulated through the massive crowd, carrying silver trays piled high with expensive caviar and crystal flutes of imported champagne. Over 100 guests dressed in custom tuxedos and glittering designer dresses laughed and mingled under the warm glow of a gigantic crystal chandelier. I stood near the entrance for a moment, simply taking in the sickening reality of the scene. My mother had died just a few weeks ago. She had spent her final days in a quiet hospice room, wearing a faded hospital gown. She had spent her entire adult life enduring my father's relentless financial abuse, wearing mended clothes and buying expired food, just to save enough money to secure my future. And here was my father throwing a party that likely cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, using junk credit loans he had illegally opened using her social security number while she was taking her final breaths. The absolute depravity of his actions fueled the fire burning inside my chest. I scanned the crowded room and quickly spotted Jessica and Chloe holding court near a massive marble fireplace. Jessica was wearing a sparkling gold dress that was far too tight, laughing loudly at a joke a local politician had just told. She was dripping in diamonds, the very diamonds Robert had bought using my mother's stolen identity. Chloe was standing right beside her, wearing a designer silk dress, holding a glass of champagne, and looking at the other guests with a smug, superior expression. They were living their ultimate fantasy, entirely convinced that they had finally secured their place among the extremely wealthy. Then my eyes found Robert. He was standing in the very center of the grand hall, completely surrounded by a group of older, wealthy businessmen. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, holding a crystal glass of dark liquor, and gesturing broadly as he spoke. He looked like a man who believed he owned the entire world. He was smiling, laughing, and projecting the absolute image of a powerful, fearless magnate. He had no idea that his bridge loans had already entered immediate catastrophic default. He had no idea that the private lending syndicate was already preparing to seize this very house. I took a deep breath and began to walk forward. Jonathan walked smoothly right beside me. As I moved through the crowded room, people naturally began to step aside. My midnight blue gown and the quiet, intense confidence of my posture commanded attention. Several guests stopped their conversations to look at me. I could hear faint whispers as I passed by. People were wondering who I was because I did not look like the terrified, broken daughter Robert had likely described to them. It only took a few moments for Robert to notice the shift in the room's energy. He turned his head and his eyes locked directly onto me. For a fraction of a second, his smile froze. I saw him take in my expensive gown, my perfectly styled hair and the tall silver-haired attorney standing at my side. He was clearly expecting me to show up in cheap clothes looking desperate and defeated. But Robert was an absolute master of self-delusion. He quickly pushed his surprise away and replaced it with a look of overwhelming, arrogant smugness. In his twisted mind, my appearance simply meant that I was finally submitting to his authority. He believed that I had dressed up to impress his guests before officially handing over the keys to the $6.8 million trust. He truly believed he had won the psychological war. Robert excused himself from the group of businessmen and walked directly toward me. His fake, benevolent smile was plastered across his face. He wanted his wealthy friends to see him acting like a gracious, forgiving patriarch, welcoming his estranged daughter back into the fold. "Sarah." He called out, his deep voice carrying over the sound of the string quartet. "I am so incredibly glad you decided to come. You actually look decent for once in your life. It is good to see you finally making an effort to fit in with our kind of people." He reached out, intending to place a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder to guide me through the crowd. I immediately took a firm step back, completely rejecting his physical touch. His hand grabbed nothing but empty air. A flash of genuine anger crossed his eyes, but he quickly suppressed it, maintaining his fake public smile. "Who is your friend here?" Robert asked, looking at Jonathan with a dismissive, arrogant sneer. "I told you to come alone, Sarah. This is a private family celebration. We do not need any unwanted guests eating our expensive food." "This is Jonathan Sterling," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady. "He is my legal advisor. I do not go anywhere without him anymore." Robert let out a short, patronizing laugh, shaking his head, as if I were a foolish child playing a silly game. "A legal advisor," he mocked. "Sarah, you cannot even afford to pay your rent, let alone hire a fancy lawyer. I suppose you found this guy working at a free public clinic. It does not matter. I do not care who you brought with you as long as you brought what I asked for." He leaned in slightly, dropping his voice so only Jonathan and I could hear him. The fake warmth completely vanished, leaving only the cold, threatening bully I had feared for my entire childhood. "You brought the passbook, right?" Robert demanded, his eyes narrowing with greedy anticipation. "You brought the paperwork." "I have exactly what you need," I replied, my expression completely unreadable. "Excellent," Robert said, a greedy, satisfied smirk spreading across his face. He gestured toward a set of heavy wooden double doors at the far end of the hall. "The relinquishment documents are already printed and sitting on my mahogany desk in the private study. My personal lawyers drafted them this morning. Let us step away from the party quietly. We will go into the private room. You will sign the papers transferring the trust funds to my name, and I will write you that $10,000 check I promised you. Then you can take your little pro bono lawyer and leave my property before you embarrass me in front of the mayor." He turned and started walking toward the private study, fully expecting me to follow him like an obedient, beaten dog. He thought he could just hide me away in a dark room, force me to sign away my mother's legacy, and return to his party as a multimillionaire. I did not move. I stood my ground right in the middle of the magnificent grand hall. Robert took 3 steps, realized I was not behind him, and turned back around. His face tightened with absolute irritation. "What are you doing?" he hissed, gesturing sharply with his hand. "Stop making a scene and get into the study right now. We have business to conclude." "I am not going anywhere with you, Robert," I said. My voice was no longer a quiet whisper. I spoke loudly and clearly, projecting my voice so that it carried over the ambient noise of the party. "I am not stepping into a private room with you so you can hide what you are doing." The nearby guests immediately stopped talking. The sharp, clear tone of my voice was completely at odds with the polite murmuring of the lavish party. Several men in expensive suits turned around, holding their crystal glasses, looking between me and Robert with sudden, intense curiosity. "Sarah, keep your voice down," Robert ordered, his tone dropping into a dangerous, threatening register. "Do not push me tonight. You are in my house. You will do exactly what I tell you to do. You came here to negotiate a settlement, so let us go into the office and finish this before I decide to completely ruin you." "I am not here to negotiate anything," I stated, my voice growing even louder, echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the mansion. I reached into the elegant silk clutch purse I was holding. I bypassed my phone and my keys and wrapped my fingers around the object resting at the very bottom. I pulled it out and held it up for Robert to see. It was the dark blue passbook. The cardboard cover was still slightly warped and stained from the freezing champagne ice water he had thrown it into on the day of my mother's funeral. The faded gold lettering caught the light of the massive crystal chandelier above us. Robert's eyes locked onto the blue booklet. A look of absolute rabid greed washed over his features. He saw the ultimate prize. He saw the key to paying off his fraudulent mortgages and securing his fake empire. He took a hasty, eager step toward me, reaching his hand out to snatch it away from me, just like Chloe had done at the reception. "Give that to me right now," Robert demanded, his voice trembling with sheer desperation. I snatched my hand back, keeping the passbook completely out of his reach. I took another step backward, planting my feet firmly into the polished hardwood floor. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with air, and I unleashed 15 years of suppressed anger right into the middle of his perfect fake reality. "Dad called this garbage at my mother's funeral," I declared, my voice ringing out with absolute crystal-clear authority. I spoke loud enough that the sound practically bounced off the walls. Every single person within a 30-foot radius stopped moving. The string quartet in the corner of the room uttered a loud screeching note escaping from the violin before the musicians stopped playing entirely. The sudden silence in the grand hall was deafening. Over 100 wealthy guests turned to stare at us. He stood in front of my mother's ashes, and he threw this exact book into a bucket of melting ice. I continued holding the warped blue passbook high in the air, so every single guest in the room could see it clearly. He laughed in my face. He told all of his important business partners that my mother died a penniless loser. He called her legacy a pathetic piece of trash. Robert went completely pale. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked around the room, seeing the shocked, confused faces of the local politicians and the bank executives he had spent the entire night trying to impress. He was losing control of the narrative, and he knew it. "Sarah, shut your mouth right now," he hissed, his voice shaking with absolute terror and rage. "You are embarrassing the family. Put that away." "But today he needs this garbage to pay for this party," I announced, refusing to lower my hand. My voice was steady, but it carried the raw emotional weight of a daughter who had watched her mother suffer for 30 years. Today he had begging me for this garbage because the bank refused to give him the $6.8 million he tried to steal. Today he needs this garbage because he has been lying to every single person in this room. The crowd erupted into a low, shocked murmur. I saw a prominent real estate developer whisper something to his wife, his eyes narrowing with sudden intense suspicion as he looked at Robert. The beautiful facade of the engagement gala was cracking violently. The fake wealthy patriarch was being exposed as a fraud right in the middle of his own living room. Jessica pushed her way through the crowd of guests, her gold dress sparkling under the lights. She looked completely frantic, her face flushed bright red with embarrassment. "Robert, what is she doing?" Jessica demanded, grabbing his arm. "Make her stop. Everyone is looking at us. Get that book from her right now." "He cannot get it, Jessica," I said, turning my fierce gaze directly onto her, "because he does not own it." My mother knew exactly what kind of man he was. She knew he was a thief and a bully. She locked this money away in a secure trust so he could never touch it. And she made me the sole legal beneficiary. "That is a lie!" Robert screamed, finally losing his temper completely. His face contorted into a mask of pure, violent rage. "That money belongs to me. It is marital property. You are trying to steal from your own father. I will have you arrested. I will have you thrown in jail." Jonathan Sterling stepped forward, cleanly placing himself between me and Robert. He did not raise his voice, but he spoke with the heavy, crushing authority of a man who commanded courtrooms for a living. "Mr. Myers," Jonathan said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a razor blade. "I am Jonathan Sterling, senior partner at Sterling & Vance. I represent Ms. Sarah Myers, and I can assure you that my client is not stealing anything. In fact, she has already presented this passbook to the bank and officially executed the Taunton Trust. The funds have been permanently secured in a private account. You have absolutely zero legal claim to a single penny of that $6.8 million. Robert's entire body seemed to deflate. The aggressive, threatening posture vanished instantly, replaced by the horrific realization that his trap had completely failed. He stared at Jonathan, his eyes wide with absolute disbelief. "What did you just say?" Robert gasped, stepping back as if he had been physically struck. "You executed the trust." "No. The bank sent me a notice. They said they needed her signature to release the funds to me." "They needed her signature to release the funds to herself," Jonathan corrected smoothly, a cold, triumphant smile appearing on his face. The notice was simply a required banking procedure for the beneficiary. "The bank never had any intention of giving you that money, Mr. Myers. You have been fighting a ghost for a week. The account is permanently locked, and you are completely locked out." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, turning into open, shocked conversation. Guests were pointing at Robert, whispering about the missing millions, and the sudden realization that the man hosting this lavish party was actually entirely broke. I stood there holding the warped blue passbook, watching the invincible monster of my childhood completely unravel in front of the entire city. The illusion of his victory was dead, and the real devastation was only just beginning. The heavy mahogany doors of the mansion loomed before us like the gates of a fortress. As Jonathan and I stepped through the grand entrance, the sheer magnitude of the engagement party washed over me. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and massive floral arrangements of white lilies and orchids that climbed the marble columns. Over 100 guests were packed into the sprawling grand hall. These were the business elites of the city, the real estate developers, the local politicians, and the wealthy investors my father had spent his entire life trying to impress. They stood in small circles holding crystal flutes of imported champagne, laughing politely at each other's jokes. A professional string quartet played a soft classical piece in the corner, providing a soundtrack to the ultimate illusion of success. I walked into the room wearing an elegant midnight blue evening gown that swept gracefully across the polished hardwood floor. The dress was a statement of power and independence paid for by the first authorized withdrawal from my mother's secure private wealth account. Jonathan walked beside me looking every bit the ruthless, high-powered attorney in his immaculate charcoal suit, carrying his thick leather briefcase. We did not blend in. We moved through the crowd with a quiet, deliberate purpose, and within seconds, the conversations around us began to slow. Heads turned. Whispers started to ripple through the sea of tuxedos and designer dresses. The guests were looking at me, trying to figure out who I was and why I was commanding so much attention. Robert was standing near a massive marble fireplace surrounded by a group of older, wealthy men. He was holding a glass of dark liquor, gesturing broadly with his free hand. He was in his element, playing the role of the self-made millionaire patriarch. When he finally noticed the shift in the room's energy, he turned his head. His eyes locked onto me. For a brief second, a flash of pure panic widened his eyes, but he quickly buried it under a thick layer of arrogant smugness. He genuinely believed that I had come to surrender. He believed that the banking notice had terrified me into submission, and that I was here to sign away my mother's $6.8 million trust fund. Robert handed his drink to a passing waiter and excused himself from his associates. He walked directly toward me, a confident, triumphant smile plastered across his face. He wanted his guests to see him handling a minor family issue with grace and absolute authority. "Sarah," he said, his deep voice carrying over the soft music, "you made it. You look surprisingly decent tonight. I'm glad you finally decided to stop being so difficult and do the right thing." He gestured toward a set of closed doors at the far end of the hall. "My personal lawyers are waiting in the private study. Let us step away from the party quietly. We will go into the private room, you will sign the relinquishment papers, and we can put all this ugly business behind us." He reached out to touch my arm, intending to guide me away from the crowd like an obedient child. I took a sharp step back, completely rejecting his physical contact. "I am not going anywhere with you, Robert," I said, my voice perfectly calm but loud enough to be heard over the string quartet. I am not stepping into a private room so you can hide the truth from your friends. The smug smile instantly vanished from Robert's face. The muscles in his jaw tightened, and his eyes darkened with a familiar, violent anger. "Keep your voice down, Sarah," he hissed, leaning in close so only Jonathan and I could hear him. "You are in my house. You are going to walk into that study and sign the papers right now, or I will completely destroy your life. Do not test me tonight." Before I could answer, Jessica and Chloe pushed their way through the crowd. Jessica was wearing a tight gold sequin dress and a massive diamond necklace that glittered aggressively under the chandelier. Chloe trailed behind her, looking furious. "What is going on here?" Jessica demanded, her voice shrill and commanding. "Why is she standing in the middle of our party?" "Robert, make her go into the office. She is ruining the aesthetic of the evening." Chloe crossed her arms and glared at me. "You really are pathetic, Sarah," she sneered. "You came here thinking you could cause a scene, but Dad already told us he has you completely cornered. You are going to sign the money over to him, and then you are going to leave. So stop being an attention-seeking brat, and do what you are told." I did not flinch. I did not back down. I reached into my elegant evening clutch and wrapped my fingers around the dark blue passbook. It was the same warped, water-stained cardboard booklet that Robert had thrown into the champagne ice bucket on the day of my mother's funeral. I pulled it out and held it high in the air right in the center of the grand hall. "Dad called this piece of cardboard garbage at my mother's funeral," I declared, my voice ringing out with crystal-clear authority. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The sudden silence in the massive room was absolute and terrifying. Every single guest turned to stare at us. He laughed in my face. He told all of his important business partners that my mother died a penniless loser. He threw her entire legacy into a bucket of melting ice. Robert went chalk white. He took a frantic step toward me, raising his hands in a desperate attempt to silence me. "Sarah, shut your mouth right now," he ordered, his voice shaking with terror. I ignored him entirely and kept the passbook raised high. "But today he needs this garbage to pay for this extravagant party," I announced, projecting my voice to the very back of the hall. "He needs this garbage because the bank absolutely refused to give him the $6,800,000 he tried to steal." Loud, shocked gasps erupted from the crowd of wealthy elites. The local politicians and business leaders began to whisper frantically among themselves. The beautiful, flawless illusion of Robert's grand debut was violently fracturing in front of their eyes. Jessica stepped forward, her face completely distorted with rage. "You are a liar," she screamed, pointing a manicured finger at my face. "That money belongs to Robert. It is marital property. You are just a jealous little girl trying to steal from your own father." Jonathan Sterling calmly stepped forward, placing himself directly beside me. He placed his heavy leather briefcase on a nearby marble table and snapped the brass latches open. The sharp metallic sound echoed perfectly in the silent room. Robert stared at the briefcase, a desperate, hungry hope flashing in his eyes. He truly believed that Jonathan was pulling out a settlement agreement. He thought my lawyer was surrendering the relinquishment documents. But Jonathan did not pull out a release of assets. He reached into the dark interior of the briefcase and withdrew two massive, thick stacks of official legal paperwork. He held them up, turning them slightly so the prominent federal seals were visible to the crowd. "Mr. Myers?" Jonathan said, his voice echoing with the crushing weight of a seasoned litigator. "I am not here to negotiate a settlement with you. I am here to deliver a formal notice of foreclosure on behalf of your private lending syndicate." He dropped the first heavy stack of papers onto the marble table. "And this second document," Jonathan continued, his tone dropping into a deadly serious register, "is a direct copy of the active prosecution file from the Federal Investigation Agency." Robert's mouth hung open. He looked back and forth between the foreclosure notice and the prosecution file, his brain completely unable to process the total destruction of his reality. I stepped forward, looking directly into my father's terrified eyes. "That $6.8 million trust fund is 100% mine legally," I declared emphatically. "It was never marital property. My mother set it up exclusively in my name to protect it from your endless greed. I have officially taken control of the entire balance and transferred it to a highly secure private account. You will never see a single penny of it. I absolutely refuse to guarantee any of your fraudulent loans." Chloe let out a loud, dramatic scoff, trying to maintain her arrogant posture. "You cannot do that," she protested, her voice wavering. "Dad owns this house. He is a multimillionaire. You are just trying to scare us." "He does not own this house, Chloe," I corrected her, my voice steady and cold. "He is drowning in millions of dollars of toxic short-term debt." Furthermore, I announced, turning to address the entire room of horrified guests, I have handed over undeniable proof to the economic police. I provided the authorities with the documents where Robert forged my dead mother's signature and stole her social security number to obtain those private bridge loans. The guests physically backed away from Robert. The men he had been joking with just 5 minutes ago were now staring at him with absolute profound disgust. He had used his dying wife's identity to fund a lavish fake lifestyle, and the entire city was witnessing his exposure. Before Robert could even formulate a single excuse, a massive authoritative pounding echoed from the heavy front doors. The sound was so demanding that several guests physically jumped. The double doors were pushed wide open, and a team of stern-looking men and women in sharp dark suits marched into the grand hall. They were flanked by 6 uniformed officers from the Federal Economic Police Division, their badges shining brightly under the crystal chandeliers. A tall man at the front of the group held up a thick clipboard. "Robert Myers," the man asked, his voice booming across the silent room. "I am Special Agent Miller with the Economic Crimes Division. We are accompanied by legal representatives from your private lending syndicate. We are here to enforce an immediate property seizure order for massive mortgage fraud, identity theft, and federal wire fraud." Robert completely broke down. The arrogant, towering bully who had terrorized my mother for 3 decades simply collapsed. His knees gave out and he fell to the polished hardwood floor. His face was entirely ashen, devoid of all color and life. He grabbed his hair with shaking hands, sobbing uncontrollably. "No," he whimpered, tears streaming down his face. "No, please, this is a mistake. Sarah, please tell them you will sign the papers. Please, Sarah, you have to save me." I looked down at the pathetic, broken man sobbing on the floor. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt only the clean, sharp sensation of absolute justice. "I told you not to push me, Robert," I said quietly. 2 uniformed officers stepped forward, hauled Robert to his feet, and pulled his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the lavish hall, sealing his fate. Jessica let out a blood-curdling, hysterical scream. She rushed toward Robert, but an officer quickly intercepted her, holding up a firm hand. "Mom, you need to step back," the officer ordered. "We have a federal court order to seize all assets purchased with the fraudulent funds linked to this address. That includes all the jewelry you are currently wearing." Jessica froze in pure terror. She looked down at the massive diamond ring on her finger. She looked at the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. "No," she shrieked, covering her chest with her hands. "These are my gifts. You cannot take my jewelry. I am going to be his wife." "He bought them with stolen money, Mom," the officer stated, his tone completely unforgiving. "Hand them over right now, or you will be arrested for possession of stolen property and obstruction of justice." The wealthy guests watched in horrified, absolute fascination as Jessica, sobbing wildly, was forced to unclip her expensive diamond necklace and slide the massive engagement ring off her shaking finger. She dropped the glittering stones into the officer's waiting evidence bag, looking entirely destroyed. Her entire identity, her entire sense of worth was tied to those shiny stolen objects. Now she was standing in a room full of millionaires, looking like a common exposed thief. Suddenly, Chloe burst back into the grand hall from the front entrance. Her face was bright red and contorted with sheer fury. She pointed a shaking finger out toward the front driveway. "Dad," she screamed, her voice cracking with outrage. "Dad, you have to do something right now. There is a massive tow truck outside. They are hooking up my brand new supercar. They are taking my car away." Chloe stopped dead in her tracks, finally noticing that Robert was standing in handcuffs and her mother was crying hysterically in the corner, stripped of her diamonds. The reality of the situation crashed down on her. The beautiful supercar, the expensive clothes, the massive mansion, it was all disappearing in the blink of an eye. The fake empire was completely dead. The economic police officers began directing the guests toward the exits, politely informing them that the property was now an active federal crime scene and the party was officially over. The elite socialites and politicians practically ran for the heavy double doors, desperate to escape the massive humiliation and avoid any professional association with Robert Myers. Within a matter of minutes, the grand hall was completely empty of partygoers, leaving only the police, the bank representatives, and the shattered, pathetic remains of my father's life. I stood near the marble table next to Jonathan Sterling. I watched the officers begin to systematically tag the expensive artwork and the antique furniture for seizure. I watched Jessica crying on the floor and Chloe screaming at a federal agent about her towed vehicle. Then I slowly walked over to where Robert was standing in handcuffs, flanked by 2 officers. He looked up at me. His eyes were wide and red-rimmed. He looked incredibly small. He looked exactly like the terrified coward my mother always knew he was. "You ruined my life," Robert whispered, his voice trembling with bitter total defeat. I looked my father straight in the eye, holding his gaze with absolute, unyielding power. The terrified 13-year-old girl was gone forever. I was a wealthy, independent woman standing over the ruins of her abuser's life. "The mess has been cleaned up," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely clear. I turned my back on him. I did not look back as I walked through the grand double doors, leaving Robert Myers to face the absolute destruction of everything he had ever valued. I walked out into the cool, crisp night air, alongside Jonathan, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of the past 15 years completely lift from my shoulders. The stars were shining brightly above the city, and as I stepped into my waiting town car, I knew for the very first time in my life that I was completely and truly free.